the quiet of a museum vault, a jade mask stares with empty eyes, its serene expression hiding secrets from a world that vanished 1,000 years ago. High in the cloud forests of Oaxaca, carved stones depict kings and captives from a city that flourished on a flattened mountaintop. And deep beneath the bustling streets of modern Mexico City lie the bones of a temple so vast, its priests believed they were holding up the sun itself, with nothing but faith and the steady rhythm of a beating human heart. These are not fictions. They are faint echoes of real worlds, whispers from civilizations that rose, shone with incredible brilliance, and then disappeared into the soil, leaving behind riddles written in stone and bone. We think we know the past, but the story of Mesoamerica is a reminder that so much of what was is now a dream, a half-remembered legend waiting in the earth. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin this journey back in time together, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet comfort to know where in the world this story is unfolding as you drift off. But to understand the mask, the mountaintop city, or the sun-drenched pyramid, we have to go back, way back, further than any king or priest, before the first drop of blood sanctified the first stone of the first temple. We have to travel back to a time when the world was gripped by ice, a time when the very shape of the continents was different, a time of giants. Our story begins in the biting, relentless wind of the late Pleistocene, perhaps 20,000 years ago. The great ice sheets, glaciers miles thick, hold so much of the world's water captive that the sea level is hundreds of feet lower than it is today. Between the eastern edge of Siberia and the western coast of Alaska, a vast continent has emerged from the shallow sea, a land bridge called Beringia. It isn't a narrow causeway for a quick afternoon stroll. It is a massive, sprawling subcontinent, 1,000 miles wide, a cold and treeless steppe tundra stretching as far as the eye can see. Through this stark, frozen landscape, a man moves. He is wrapped in heavy furs, his face weathered by a wind that never seems to stop, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. He carries a spear dipped with a meticulously chipped stone point, its edges lethally sharp. He is following the herds, just as his father did, and his father before him. He isn't thinking about discovering a new world. He is thinking about the hunger in his children's bellies, about the tracks of the woolly mammoth, about the location of the next sheltered river valley, where his small band of perhaps 20 or 30 people can find refuge from the unforgiving cold. He and his family are part of a slow generational drift, a current of humanity flowing eastward, drawn by the immense herds of megafauna that graze on the hardy grasses of Beringia. They live and die on this lost continent for thousands of years, a population isolated between the Siberian mountains and the impassable wall of ice that covers all of Canada. The hunter feels the ground tremble long before he sees it. A herd of mammoths, colossal beings with shaggy coats and tusks that curve like silent smiles, moves with the slow, deliberate weight of living mountains. To bring one down is a task of unimaginable danger and coordination, a frantic dance of spears and shouting against a creature the size of a small house. But success means survival. It means hundreds of pounds of meat to be smoked and stored, thick hides for shelter and clothing, and massive bones to build the framework of their huts. It means fat for their lamps, and ivory for tools and sacred objects. These people are not just surviving. They are masters of this brutal environment. Their technology perfectly suited to this world of ice and giants. Their toolkit is light but deadly, containing everything needed to process an animal many times their size. They didn't have much baggage to worry about, which is a plus. No checked bag fees on the Beringia Express. Then, over the course of centuries, something begins to change. The endless cold relinquishes its grip ever so slightly. The world warms. The great ice sheets that blanket North America begin to melt, and as they retreat, a path opens up. An ice-free corridor, a raw new channel of land, emerges between the two main glaciers. It's a bleak and desolate passage at first, but slowly, life takes hold for the people living in Beringia. This is a new frontier, a doorway into an entire hemisphere untouched by human hands. And so they move, not in a great wave of conquest, but in trickles, small family groups venturing south into the unknown. For much of the 20th century, the story was that these were the Clovis people, named for the distinctively fluted spear points first found in Clovis, New Mexico. The beauty and deadly efficiency of these points, which allowed them to be hafted securely onto a spear shaft, were seen as the key that unlocked the continent, allowing hunters to spread with astonishing speed, wiping out the megafauna as they went. But the earth keeps its secrets well, and it doesn't always give them up in the right order. Historians still argue whether the Clovis people were truly the first. Sites like Monteverde in southern Chile have yielded evidence of human occupation that is thousands of years older, suggesting that perhaps another route was taken. Some believe the first Americans didn't walk through the ice corridor at all, but instead paddled down the coast in small boats, living off the rich marine life of the kelp forests, leapfrogging from one cove to the next, all the way down the Pacific coast. Whether by land or by sea, they arrived. They stepped out of the ice and into a world of bewildering variety. They found vast grasslands teeming with bison, dense forests, scorching deserts, and lush, tropical river valleys. The hunter, who had known only the frozen steppe, now saw trees with leaves as wide as his body, heard the calls of birds he could not name, and felt a humid warmth on his skin that was entirely alien. He and his descendants adapted with breathtaking speed. Within just a few thousand years, a mere blink in geological time, humans had populated the entirety of the Americas, from the northern ice to the windswept tip of Tierra del Fuego. Imagine trying to tell your grandchildren that you used to hunt something the size of a two-story cabin with a pointy stick. They'd think you were telling tall tales. But for these first peoples, it was just life. As they settled into the warmer, narrower isthmus of land that would one day be called Mesoamerica, the last of the giants, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, began to vanish, their extinction driven by the changing climate and the relentless pressure of these new, astonishingly clever hunters. The world of the Great Hunt was ending, and a new way of living, a new relationship with the land itself, was about to begin. quietly, with the simple act of noticing a promising seed. The world is quieter now. The earth no longer trembles under the weight of mammoths, and the hunter, the man whose story began our journey, now stalks smaller, faster prey. White-tailed deer in the wooded uplands, peccaries in the dense, humid thickets of the lowlands. His finely crafted spear point, once designed to pierce the hide of a giant, is still a tool of survival. But the grand drama of the Pleistocene hunt has faded into the stuff of fireside legends, stories told to wide-eyed children about a time their great-grandfathers walked with monsters. The focus of life has shifted from the singular dramatic pursuit of massive game to 1,000 smaller, more intimate negotiations with the land. The spear is still important, but the basket is becoming essential. Survival now depends less on courage and more on a deep, patient knowledge of place, a knowledge held not just by the hunter, but by the woman who walks the landscape with him. She moves through the tall grasses of a river valley, her eyes scanning not the horizon, but the ground at her feet. Her world is a tapestry of subtle details. The precise shade of green that means a leaf is ready to be gathered. The slight swell of the earth that signals a nutritious tuber below. The cautionary red of a berry that brings only sickness. She carries the collective memory of her people in her mind, an encyclopedia of plants, a calendar of ripening, a map of the seasonal bounty that this new, warmer world provides. Her family group is still nomadic, but their wandering is not aimless. They follow a familiar circuit, a seasonal round that takes them from the cool, dry highlands in one season to the lush, wet lowlands in another, following the rhythm of the earth itself. They are not yet farmers, but they are no longer just passive takers. They are beginning to manage the landscape, clearing away competing plants to encourage a patch of useful gourds, deliberately replanting the top of a wild onion so it will grow again. They are gardeners of the wild. In her gathering, she comes across a particular grass. It's a gangly, unassuming plant called teosinte. To our modern eyes, it would look like nothing more than a weed, and a rather pathetic one at that. It doesn't have a big, juicy cob, but a small, brittle stalk with a single row of 5 to 12 kernels. And these kernels are a real piece of work. Each one is locked away in a stony, tooth-cracking hard casing. Getting to the tiny bit of starchy food inside requires a great deal of effort for very little reward. It was the kind of plant you'd walk past 1,000 times without a second glance. The ancient equivalent of a superfood fad. Probably good for you, but so much trouble you wonder if it's worth it. Yet, for reasons we can only guess, some ancient people in the Balsas River Valley of what is now southern Mexico, about 9,000 years ago, saw something in this plant. They saw potential. The woman, or someone very much like her, begins the slow, unconscious miracle. She notices that not all teosinte plants are created equal. One plant, by some random genetic quirk, has slightly larger kernels. Another has a casing that's a little less like a rock. When she gathers seeds, she naturally favors these superior plants. And when she scatters a few of those seeds in a cleared patch of ground near her seasonal camp, she is doing something revolutionary. She is editing the future. She doesn't know it, of course. She is not thinking about genetics or agriculture. She is simply a pragmatist, choosing the best of what she can find. But generation after generation, this simple act of selection is a powerful evolutionary force. The daughter learns from the mother, and she too selects the plumpest kernels from the most promising stalks. Over a span of time that is difficult for us to comprehend, perhaps 4,000 years, this patient, multi-generational partnership between human and plant transforms the scrawny weed into a miracle crop. The hard casing recedes, then vanishes, becoming the soft, papery gloom at the base of a modern kernel. The single row of seeds multiplies, arranging itself into the tightly packed rows of a cob. The plant itself grows larger, more robust, producing more cobs. It becomes an entirely new species, one that we call maize or corn. This new creation is a marvel of productivity, but it has paid a price for its generosity. It has become utterly dependent on its human partners, with its seeds now clinging tightly to a central cob, wrapped in a protective husk. Maize can no longer spread its own seeds to the wind. If humanity were to disappear tomorrow, maize would follow it into extinction within a few years. It is a plant we made, and a plant that, in turn, made us. And maize did not rise alone. As villages became more permanent, these early farmers developed a perfect agricultural trinity. They planted their maize, and once the stalks were high enough, they planted beans at their base. The bean vines would climb the sturdy maize stalks as if they were living trellises. More than just a support system, the beans performed a hidden magic, pulling nitrogen from the air and fixing it in the soil, replenishing the very nutrients the hungry maize consumed. And around them both, they planted squash. The large, broad leaves of the squash vines spread across the ground like a living mulch, shading the soil to retain moisture and choking out the weeds that would compete for sun and water. This combination, the three sisters, was a nutritional masterpiece. The maize provided carbohydrates, the beans were rich in protein, and the squash offered a wealth of vitamins and healthy oils. Together, they formed the engine of Mesoamerican civilization. This agricultural revolution changed everything. With a reliable, storable food source, the old nomadic life, the endless seasonal round, was no longer necessary. People began to settle down in one place, establishing the first permanent villages. More food meant the population could grow beyond the small, mobile bands of the past. Life in a village brought new needs and new inventions. Clay pots were needed to store the precious grain, safe from moisture and pests. The hard, dried kernels of maize had to be processed, giving rise to the tireless work of grinding stones, the mano and metate, whose rhythmic scrape would become the background music of daily life for millennia. For the first time in human history, there was a surplus. Not just a surplus of food, but a surplus of time. When you don't have to spend every waking moment of your day searching for your next meal, you can do other things. You can perfect the art of pottery, learn to weave intricate textiles, or simply sit and study the movements of the sun and stars. It's the ancient equivalent of no longer having to spend all day at the grocery store. Suddenly, you have time for hobbies like inventing calendars or building pyramids. From this surplus, specialization was born. The artist, the priest, the chief, all were fed by the farmer. The seeds of society were being sown right alongside the maize. The farmer's world, once bounded by the edges of his family's maize field and the rhythm of the seasons, begins to expand. The surplus he and his neighbors coax from the earth, stored in newfangled clay pots, has created a kind of gravity, pulling people together into larger and larger villages. But this abundance creates a new set of problems. Who manages the surplus grain, ensuring there's enough to get through a dry season? Who settles the inevitable disputes between families over land and water? And who has the authority to ask the gods for their continued favor? Out of these questions, a new kind of person emerges. He is not just a village elder. He is a chief, a man who claims a closer connection to the unseen forces of the natural world. He convinces the farmer that some of his maize, some of his labor, should be given not just to his family, but to the community, to the chief, for the good of all. In return, the chief will organize the building of storehouses, manage the irrigation canals, and most importantly, mediate with the powerful spirits of the rain, the earth, and the sky. This great social experiment first catches fire, not in the temperate highlands or the dry, open valleys, but in a place that seems, at first glance, deeply inhospitable. We travel now to the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, to a land of suffocating humidity, a flat, swampy plain crisscrossed by sluggish rivers that regularly overflow their banks. This is the Olmec heartland. The air is thick, alive with the drone of insects and the sudden guttural roar of a howler monkey from the dense canopy of trees. Here, around 1400 BCE, in this world of mud and water, the descendants of those first maize growers do something unprecedented. At a site we now call San Lorenzo, they begin to move the earth itself. They are not content to live on the floodplains. They organize themselves to build a new landscape, hauling millions of cubic feet of earth in baskets to create a colossal artificial plateau, a sacred ridge lifted high above the annual floods, reshaping their world to suit their vision. From his village, the farmer is summoned. The chief, a man now imbued with an aura of command and divine right, demands his service. He is to join hundreds, perhaps thousands, of other men on a project of monumental scale. His destination is the Tuxtla Mountains, a range of volcanic peaks that rise from the coastal plain nearly 100 kilometers away. His task is to help quarry a massive boulder of basalt, a dark, incredibly hard volcanic rock. He watches as skilled craftsmen, using nothing but harder stone tools and patient effort, pound and grind at the rock, slowly freeing a block weighing 20, maybe 30 tons. And then the real work begins. There are no wheels here, no beasts of burden like oxen or horses to pull the load. There is only human muscle and ingenuity. The great stone is maneuvered onto a massive balsa wood raft, and the farmer joins the teams who guide it down the rivers, straining with ropes and levers to keep it from sinking into the murky water or getting stuck in the mud of the riverbank. After months of toil, the stone arrives at San Lorenzo, and then the farmer sees the magic happen. Under the direction of master sculptors, the shapeless boulder is transformed. Using stone hammers and abrasive sand, they chip and polish, and slowly a face emerges. It is a face of immense power and presence. The cheeks are full and fleshy, the nose is broad and flat, the lips thick and slightly downturned in an expression of serene, confident authority. The eyes, though just lifeless stone, seem to stare into a distant future. On its head is a snug-fitting cap, like a helmet, decorated with intricate symbols unique to this one stone. When it is finished, it is a head 9 feet tall, a perfect, individual portrait. It is the face of his chief, transformed into a god on earth. This wasn't a weekend DIY project. This was a massive, state-run enterprise, the ancient equivalent of a space program, demanding incredible resources, planning, and the will to convince thousands of people to haul a rock the size of your car through 100 kilometers of swamp. These mysterious colossal heads are the most famous legacy of the Olmec. For a long time, they were seen as the definitive proof that the Olmec were the cultura madre, the mother culture of all later Mesoamerican civilizations. The idea was that here, in the swamps of the Gulf Coast, all the key ingredients of civilization were invented first: divine kingship, monumental architecture, writing, the calendar, the sacred ball game. But in history, simple stories are rarely the whole story. Historians still argue whether the Olmec were a true mother culture, whose innovations were passed down like a family inheritance, or more of a sister culture, one of several early societies that were developing complex ideas in parallel, trading them back and forth in a vibrant, competitive network. Whatever the answer, the Olmec were undeniably innovators. In their smaller carvings of jade and serpentine, precious greenstones imported from hundreds of miles away, we see the emergence of a distinct and powerful religious art. The central figure is often a strange hybrid creature, part human and part jaguar, a jaguar, often depicted as a crying infant with a snarling feline mouth. This may have been their primary deity, a powerful rain god, or perhaps an emblem of the ruling lineage, who claimed the mighty jaguar as their spiritual ancestor. They laid out their ceremonial centers with a deliberate cosmic alignment, and they began to experiment with symbols that seemed to be the first steps toward a true writing system. Then, around 900 BCE, the power of San Lorenzo flickered and died. The story ends as mysteriously as it began. The great monuments were not just abandoned, they were deliberately destroyed. The colossal heads, those powerful portraits of the divine rulers, were laboriously dragged from their plazas, systematically mutilated, their noses smashed, their faces scarred, and then carefully, ritually buried. Was it an invasion by jealous rivals? Was it a violent uprising of the farmers against their demanding rulers? Or was it a sacred ritual, a way of desanctifying the potent image of a dead king to make way for his successor? It's the ultimate form of throwing shade at the previous administration, making sure their portraits can't judge you from the walls of the palace. Whatever the cause, the first great Olmec center was abandoned, its power broken. But the idea of the Olmec, the potent combination of kingship, religion, and monumental art, was not buried with the heads. It had already seeped into the fertile soil of Mesoamerica, and a new Olmec capital was already beginning to rise from the swamps, ready to carry that legacy forward. The smashed and buried faces of the San Lorenzo kings are a testament to a world turned upside down, a dynasty erased. But an idea, once born, is harder to kill than a king. The powerful concepts the Olmec had unleashed, of divine rulers, of monumental labor in service of the gods, of a cosmos that could be understood and placated through ritual, did not vanish into the mud with the broken statues. The center of the Olmec world simply shifted, moving like the sluggish rivers of the heartland, eastward to a new home, a new sanctuary. The political fire that had been extinguished at San Lorenzo was rekindled on an island, a patch of high ground in a coastal swamp near the Tonala River. This would be the seat of the next great Olmec dynasty, a ceremonial center whose name is now lost to us, which we simply call La Venta. Here, beginning around 900 BCE, Olmec civilization reached its most refined and extravagant expression. La Venta was a place built according to a celestial blueprint. An architect, or perhaps a priest with a deep knowledge of the stars, stood on that island and envisioned a sacred city, not haphazardly arranged, but laid out on a precise axis, aligned 8 degrees west of true north. Historians still debate the meaning of this specific alignment. Perhaps it pointed to a sacred mountain on the horizon, or marked the position of a key star at a certain time of year. But it was deliberate, infusing the entire city with a sense of cosmic order. At the southern end of this axis, they built the Great Pyramid, a fluted cone of packed earth rising over 100 feet high. It was one of the very first pyramids in Mesoamerica, a man-made, sacred mountain that dominated the flat, swampy landscape, a focal point for the spiritual energy of the entire kingdom. But the most astonishing rituals at La Venta happened in secret, hidden from public view, and then hidden from the sun itself. A priest directs a team of laborers as they dig a massive rectangular pit, more than 20 feet deep, into the colorful clay of the island. At the bottom, other teams carefully lay down a floor made of hundreds of tons of serpentine blocks, precious greenstone that had been quarried and hauled from distant sources. On top of this foundation, master artisans assemble a huge, abstract mosaic from smaller blocks of colored stone, perhaps the stylized face of the jaguar god. It is a work of incredible beauty and precision, a masterpiece meant for divine eyes only. For as soon as it is finished, the priest gives the final order: bury it. The workers fill the pit, and the magnificent offering disappears forever. It is the ultimate display of devotion and power, like commissioning a priceless work of art, and then immediately sealing it in a vault. The point was not for people to see it. The point was for the cosmos to know it was there. This reverence for greenstone, especially jade, became an obsession for the rulers of La Venta. Their artisans, using simple drills of reed and bone with sand as an abrasive, performed miracles on this incredibly hard material. They crafted figurines with the classic Olmec features: the downturned mouth, the almond eyes, and carved intricate scenes onto polished stone axes, or celts, that were never meant to cut wood, but served as objects of sacred power. This jade was not local. Its only known source in Mesoamerica is the Motagua River Valley in modern-day Guatemala, hundreds of miles away through treacherous mountains and jungles. The presence of so much jade at La Venta is hard proof of a vast, sophisticated trade network that bound the Olmec heartland to the far-flung peoples of the south and west. It was through these trade networks that the Olmec legacy began to spread. They did not build an empire of conquest with garrisons and governors. Instead, Their influence radiated outwards through the power of their ideas and the prestige of their beautiful goods. A minor chieftain in the highlands of Morelos, wanting to bolster his authority, would trade for Olmec-style pottery or a polished jade pendant. He would adopt the snarling motif of the were-jaguar for his own regalia, linking himself to the powerful religion of the Gulf Coast. Olmec art and symbols begin to appear far and wide, from the rock carvings at Chalcatzingo, depicting rulers sitting on thrones within the mouths of mythical monsters, to the pottery styles of the Valley of Oaxaca. It was less of an empire and more of a cultural franchise. You could open up your own local branch of Olmec-style kingship, complete with the Jaguar infant logo and the ceremonial greenstone. Did they also export a system of writing? Perhaps. In a gravel pit in Veracruz, a stone tablet was discovered, now called the Cascajal block. It's covered in 62 distinct signs, some recognizable as Olmec motifs like maize or insects, others completely abstract. If it is authentic, it is by far the earliest evidence of writing in the Americas, dating back to the height of San Lorenzo. But its discovery outside of a clear archaeological context has made it a subject of fierce controversy. Historians and archaeologists are locked in a debate over its meaning and its authenticity. It remains a tantalizing but uncertain clue, a whisper of a written language that has otherwise been lost. By 400 BCE, the cycle of rise and fall repeated itself, for reasons that are still unclear. Perhaps a shift in the course of a key river, environmental exhaustion, or internal social strife. La Venta was also abandoned. Its great monuments were toppled, its stone altars were defaced, and its power faded back into the swamps. The Olmec, as a coherent, dominant culture, were finished. The heartland grew quiet, but they had provided the cultural DNA for everything that was to come. They had established the template of divine kingship, the importance of a sacred calendar, the practice of ritual bloodletting, a pantheon of gods centered on maize and rain, and the basic layout of the ceremonial center. The mother culture was gone, but her children, scattered across Mesoamerica and nourished by her legacy, were just beginning to stir. In the southern jungles, a new people were taking these ideas and transforming them into something uniquely their own. As the last ceremonial fires die out at La Venta and the Olmec heartland fades into a quiet backwater, the cultural seeds they had scattered across the land begin to germinate in new and fertile soil. Our story now moves south, leaving the humid coastal swamps for the vast, dense rainforest of the Petén Basin in what is now northern Guatemala. This is a world drenched in green, a seemingly endless canopy that filters the tropical sun into a shifting, dappled light on the forest floor. It is a land of thin, fragile soil and a dramatic seasonal cycle of torrential rain followed by months of brutal drought. At first glance, it seems an even more challenging place to build a civilization than the Olmec swamps. Yet it was here, among the screeching parrots and silent jaguars, that the people who called themselves the Maya began their own ascent. For centuries, while the Olmec kings were commissioning their colossal heads, small Maya-speaking villages had been quietly cultivating their maize fields throughout this forest. They were aware of the Olmec, trading with them for prestigious goods like jade and absorbing some of their religious and political ideas. In early centers like Nakbe, dating to as early as 1000 BCE, they began to experiment with building on a larger scale, constructing stone platforms and plaster-coated pyramids. They were learning the language of power that the Olmec had written in stone. But around the 6th century BCE, as Olmec influence waned, one of these Maya centers began to grow with an explosive, almost alarming energy. It was a city called El Mirador, and for a few centuries, it would become the largest and most powerful metropolis in the Americas, a true lost city of giants. A traveler approaching El Mirador would have walked for weeks through an almost unbroken jungle, following a narrow trail. Then, he would have noticed the forest thinning, giving way to extensive managed wetlands and maize fields. And then he would see it. A white mountain, impossibly huge, piercing the canopy and gleaming in the tropical sun. This was the Danta complex, the heart of El Mirador. To stand at its base would be a humbling, terrifying experience. This was not a single pyramid, but a masterpiece of layered, mountain-like architecture. It began with a colossal man-made platform, a stone-faced podium 700 feet wide, 1,000 feet long, and 30 feet high, a stage vast enough to hold a dozen European cathedrals. Upon this stage rose another series of platforms and smaller pyramids, culminating in a final temple that soared more than 230 feet above the jungle floor. By sheer volume of rock and earth, the Danta complex is one of the most massive structures ever built in the ancient world. The building codes must have been a nightmare. Imagine the paperwork for a foundation that size, submitted in triplicate hieroglyphs. On the other side of the city's core rose another giant, the El Tigre Pyramid, nearly as tall. Connecting these great temple complexes and residential areas was another marvel of engineering, the Sac-Beob, or Whiteways. These were raised causeways, sometimes over 100 feet wide, and paved with crushed limestone, which gave them a brilliant white surface that would have glowed uncannily under the stars or a full moon. They were highways of stone, cutting straight through the difficult terrain, connecting the city's heart to its suburbs and even to other subordinate cities miles away. This was the infrastructure of a powerful, centralized state, ruled by a dynasty of kings who could command the labor of tens, perhaps hundreds, of thousands of people. These kings proclaimed their divine connections not on colossal stone heads, but in vibrant narrative art made of stucco, a lime-based plaster. Archaeologists at El Mirador have uncovered stunning examples of this work. Great masks of jaguar and bird deities flanking the stairways of the pyramids. Most importantly, they have found panels that depict scenes from the Popol Vuh, the sacred creation myth of the Maya. There, modeled in plaster 3 centuries before the birth of Christ, are the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, the central figures of the epic. This was a revolutionary discovery. It proved that the mythological framework that we associate with the classic Maya was already ancient when cities like Tikal were just minor villages. The Maya of El Mirador were not just building big. They were building a universe, giving physical form to their most sacred stories. But the gigantism of El Mirador could not be sustained. Sometime around 150 CE, after centuries of dominance, the city met a catastrophic end. This was not the famous classic Maya collapse. This was a dress rehearsal, a pre-classic collapse that was in some ways even more complete. The great plazas fell silent. The voices of the priests no longer echoed from the pyramid tops, and the jungle began its patient work of reclamation, covering the white stucco with a blanket of green. What happened? Scholars continue to debate the primary cause of this early collapse. One leading theory points to ecological suicide. To create the vast quantities of lime plaster needed to coat their ever larger pyramids, the Maya had to burn immense quantities of green wood. This may have led to widespread deforestation, causing massive soil erosion and turning the surrounding landscape into a barren, swampy wasteland, unable to support the huge population. It's a cautionary tale for anyone who's ever gotten a little too enthusiastic with a home renovation project. Other theories point to prolonged drought, the outbreak of disease, or relentless warfare between El Mirador and its rising rivals. Whatever the cause, the first great flowering of Maya civilization was over. The city of El Mirador was so thoroughly abandoned that its location was lost to the outside world for 18 centuries. Its titanic pyramids mistaken for natural, jungle-covered hills. The survivors of this collapse scattered, carrying with them the memory of greatness, the technology of pyramid building, and the stories of the gods. They settled in smaller communities, biding their time, waiting through a period of disruption and realignment. The era of the giants was over, but the stage was now set for a new act, one in which not one, but several great Maya kingdoms would rise from the ashes to struggle for supremacy under the watchful eyes of their ancestors and their gods. The jungle that swallowed the giants of El Mirador remained quiet for a time, a green and silent tomb for a civilization that had reached too high, too fast. But the Maya people did not vanish. They endured in smaller settlements, carrying the embers of their culture through a period of uncertainty. Then, around 250 CE, a new light begins to dawn in the Peten. This is the beginning of what scholars call the classic period, and the political landscape that emerges is profoundly different. The age of the single superpower is over. In its place rises a constellation of dozens of competing city-states, each ruled by a Ku'uhul Ajau, a holy lord who saw himself as a divine king, a living conduit between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. These kings built soaring pyramids, commissioned intricate art, and crucially, they began to write their own histories in startling detail, carving the deeds of their dynasties onto tall stone monuments called stelae, creating a record of their triumphs and failures that we are still learning to read. Out of this competitive tapestry of kingdoms, two cities began to emerge as the dominant forces, two poles of power around which the entire Maya world would soon revolve. The first was an old city, one that had been a modest center during the pre-classic and had survived the collapse. It was a place whose ancient name was Mutal, which we now know as Tikal. Located in the heart of the Peten, Tikal's rulers began to build ever higher temples, sharp-edged pyramids that would eventually become so tall their stone roof combs would poke through the jungle canopy like the spines on a crocodile's back. For a time, Tikal was just one strong kingdom among many. But then, on a fateful day in January of the year 378, everything changed. A scribe at Tikal, painting in a codex or perhaps preparing a text for a stone carver, records a shocking event. Stranger has arrived. His name is Siaj Kark, which means fire is born, and he comes dressed as a warrior from the mighty city of Teotihuacan, the great metropolis far to the west in the highlands of central Mexico. On the very day that this foreign warlord arrives at Tikal, the city's king, Chak Tok Ichak, the great jaguar paw, dies. It is almost certainly not a coincidence. A new king, the son of a Teotihuacano lord, is soon installed on Tikal's throne, beginning a new dynasty with a direct link to the most powerful city in Mesoamerica. The exact nature of this event is still a subject of intense debate among historians. Was it a brutal military conquest, a cunningly arranged dynastic marriage, or something in between? Whatever the details, the result was clear. Tikal was transformed, infused with the prestige and perhaps the military tactics of Teotihuacan. It became an aggressive, expansionist new power in the Maya heartland. But Tikal did not rise unchallenged. Far to the north, another powerful kingdom was consolidating its own sphere of influence. This was the domain of the Kanul dynasty, the Snake Kingdom, whose capital we now call Calakmul. While Tikal's power was often projected through direct military might, Calakmul's rulers were masters of diplomacy and grand strategy. The Holy Lord of the Snake Kingdom would look out upon the political landscape and see not territory to be conquered, but a web of alliances to be woven. He sent emissaries to the courts of smaller kingdoms, offering lavish gifts, military support, and royal marriages, slowly and patiently turning Tikal's neighbors into his own loyal vassals. His goal was not to meet Tikal head-on, but to encircle it, to cut off its trade routes and surround it with his allies, strangling it into submission. It was the ultimate game of geopolitical chess, played with obsidian blades and quetzal feathers over a board the size of a country. Thus began the great defining conflict of the classic Maya world, a century-spanning struggle between the Mutal dynasty of Tikal and the Kanul dynasty of Calakmul. It was a rivalry that pulled every other kingdom into its orbit. The lords of cities like Caracol, Dos Pilas, and Naranjo were forced to choose a side, to swear allegiance to the jaguar or the serpent. Their fortunes, and often their very lives, depended on making the right choice at the right time. A declaration of war was a solemn, cosmic affair. Kings would time their attacks to align with celestial events, like the first appearance of the planet Venus as the morning star, a harbinger of war and death. These were the Star Wars of the Maya. The goal of these conflicts was rarely to seize and occupy enemy territory. The ultimate prize was the capture of the rival king. A captured lord would be taken back to the victor's city, publicly humiliated, and then ritually sacrificed on the steps of the Great Pyramid, his divine blood feeding the gods and confirming the victor's mandate to rule. For decades, the two superpowers skirmished and maneuvered. But in the year 562, the Snake Kingdom's grand strategy paid off. An alliance of Calakmul's vassals, led by the King of Caracol, launched a major star war against Tikal. They defeated Tikal's army, captured its king, Wak Chan Kawil, and sacrificed him. For Tikal, the defeat was catastrophic. The city entered a century of profound darkness and silence, known as the Tikal hiatus. No new monuments were erected. No grand temples were built. The scribes fell silent. It was the ancient equivalent of your favorite TV show, going off the air for 100 years on a terrible cliffhanger. The people of Tikal must have lived under a pall of humiliation and fear as the snake lords of Calakmul stood supreme, their network of allies now controlling nearly the entire Maya world. The serpent seemed invincible, its coils wrapped tightly around the heart of the jungle, while the great serpent of Calakmul held the heart of the Beten in its coils, and the proud jaguar of Tikal slumbered in a forced, silent hiatus. The Maya world was far from static. On the western edge of their lands, where the flat jungle lowlands begin to crumple into the foothills of the Chiapas Mountains, other kingdoms were writing their own, very different stories. Our journey now takes us to one of the most beautiful places in Mesoamerica, a city whose ancient name was Lacama, or Big Water, for the clear rivers and waterfalls that cascade through its center. We know it today as Palenque. Unlike the sprawling, flat cities of the Petén, Palenque was a more intimate place. Its white stone buildings nestled with breathtaking artistry against the steep, jungle-covered hills. But its beauty masked a troubled history. In the years before our story here begins, Palenque had been repeatedly attacked and sacked by the armies of the Snake Kingdom, a pawn in Calakmul's grand strategy against Tikal. The city was weakened, its dynasty shaken, its future uncertain. Into this precarious situation, in the year 615, a boy ascended to the throne. He was only 12 years old. His name was Kinich Janab Bakal, or Great Sun Shield. For the first years of his rule, he was guided by his mother, the formidable Lady Sak Cook, who acted as regent, steering the battered kingdom back toward stability. No one could have known it at the time, but this young boy would not be a mere placeholder. He would rule for 68 years, an almost unheard of reign. And in that time, he would transform Palenque from a victim into an architectural and artistic jewel, a beacon of culture that would shine for centuries. Pakal was a builder, a man with a vision. Under his long and stable rule, the city was reborn. He commissioned the construction of magnificent new buildings and the expansion of the city's royal palace into a sprawling, labyrinthine complex of courtyards, galleries, and residential quarters. He crowned the palace with a unique four-story tower, a structure that may have served as an astronomical observatory or a watchtower, a symbol of his power that dominated the city's central precinct. But his greatest project, the one that would consume decades of his reign and secure his immortality, was his own tomb. On a hillside overlooking the palace, he began the construction of a temple that would be his forever house. We call it the Temple of the Inscriptions. It is a work of sublime elegance, a nine-stepped pyramid crowned with a temple, its proportions perfectly balanced. On the temple's inner walls, scribes carved the longest continuous hieroglyphic text ever found in the Maya world, a detailed history of Palenque's royal dynasty, and a cosmic justification for Pakal's own reign, linking his life to the deeds of the gods at the dawn of time. It is the most elaborate About Me page in history, ensuring his legacy would have top billing for the next 1,000 years. For centuries after Palenque was abandoned to the jungle, the Temple of the Inscriptions was assumed to be just that, a temple on a solid pyramid base. But in 1948, A Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruz Luillier was excavating the temple floor when he noticed something odd. One of the massive stone slabs had a double row of holes in it, fitted with removable stone plugs. It looked like a handle. With great effort, his team lifted the slab to reveal a sight that quickened his pulse. The beginning of a staircase descending into the dark heart of the pyramid. The passage was not open. It had been deliberately, completely filled with tons of rock and rubble. For 4 long, grueling field seasons, Ruse and his crew worked to clear that passage. In the humid, claustrophobic darkness, they dug their way down, step by step, deeper and deeper, following the secret path the Maya had sealed more than 1,000 years before. Finally, in 1952, they reached the bottom, where they found a stone wall and a triangular doorway. A small section of the wall was removed, and Russ, holding a lamp, peered into the space beyond. The air was thick and still, the silence of centuries absolute. What he saw took his breath away. He was looking into a vaulted crypt, its walls covered in beautiful stucco reliefs of 9 figures, the 9 lords of the Maya underworld. And filling the center of the chamber, from wall to wall, was a colossal, monolithic limestone box, covered in intricate carvings. It was the sarcophagus of King Pakal. The 5-ton lid of the sarcophagus is one of the single greatest masterpieces of Mesoamerican art. It does not depict a dead king lying in state. Instead, it captures a moment of cosmic transformation. Pakal is shown alive, youthful, and adorned in the guise of the maize god. He is caught in a moment of motion, reclining at the base of a great world tree, which represents the center of the universe. Above him, a celestial bird, a symbol of the heavens, perches in the branches. Below him, the skeletal jaws of the earth monster, the entrance to the underworld, gape open to receive him. He is simultaneously falling into the underworld and being reborn from it, just as maize sprouts from the earth. Some modern observers, unfamiliar with Maya cosmology, saw a man at the controls of a rocket ship, complete with flames coming out of the bottom. While it's an entertaining thought, it says more about our modern obsessions than it does about the ancient Maya, who were clearly depicting the king's journey through their sacred, multi-layered universe. The discovery of Pakal's tomb revolutionized our understanding of Maya pyramids, proving that some, like their Egyptian counterparts, were indeed funerary monuments for divine kings. Pakal's long, stable reign had not only rebuilt his city, but had also laid the foundation for his sons, who would succeed him and continue his work, bringing Palenque to the absolute zenith of its artistic achievement, a tranquil and scholarly kingdom of art and astronomy, flourishing on the western frontier, far from the brutal superpower conflict that still consumed the heartland. The tranquil city of Palenque, with its elegant towers and cascading waterfalls, was a place dedicated to knowledge. The long historical text on the walls of Pakal's tomb is a testament to a culture obsessed not just with power, but with time, lineage, and the very structure of the cosmos. To understand the actions of the Maya kings, to grasp why they went to war according to the movements of the planets, or why they built their cities as mirror images of a celestial plan, we must first take a quiet moment to step out of the stream of political history and into their extraordinary intellectual world. We need to understand the universe as they did. For a Maya scribe, the world was a tri-level creation, a cosmic house with a celestial overworld, a terrestrial middle world, and a watery underworld called Xibalba, the place of fear. This middle world, the realm of humanity, was not a globe, but a flat, four-cornered space, like the surface of a maze field. At each of the four cardinal directions stood a sacred tree of a specific color: red for the east, white for the north, black for the west, and yellow for the south. And at the absolute center of the universe, a fifth, magnificent green tree, the great saber, grew. This was the world tree, the axis mundi, its roots deep in the underworld, its trunk passing through the human realm, and its branches soaring into the heavens, connecting all three layers of existence. It was along this cosmic tree that souls and gods could travel. When we looked at the sarcophagus lid of King Pakal, we saw him poised on this very tree, beginning his journey of transformation. Time for the Maya was not the linear, abstract arrow that we imagine. Time was alive. It was a procession of divine beings, of gods, each of whom carried a burden of fate. The nature of any given day was determined by the specific combination of gods who were marching in this eternal procession. This is why their calendars were so complex and so central to their existence. To know the calendar was to know the will of the gods, to understand the sacred qualities of time itself. To be a calendar priest, an Kin or daykeeper, was to be one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. This mastery of time was built upon a foundation of beautifully simple and powerful mathematics. They used a vigesimal or base 20 number system, likely born from the simple act of counting on all 10 fingers and all 10 toes. It's a system that makes perfect sense if you're used to doing math in your sandals. Their notation was a marvel of elegance. A single dot represented the number 1. A horizontal bar represented 5. And, in an intellectual leap of genius that eluded many other great civilizations like the Romans, they independently developed the concept of zero, which they represented with a shell symbol. With just these three symbols, a Maya scribe could represent any number imaginable and perform complex calculations needed for their astronomical observations and calendrical predictions. Upon this mathematical base, they built their interlocking calendars. The first was the Tzolkin, a 260-day sacred almanac. It combined a cycle of 20 named days with a cycle of 13 numbers. Every Maya child was often named for the day of their birth in this calendar, and its sacred energies were believed to shape their destiny. Running parallel to this was the Hab, a 365-day civil calendar that approximated the solar year. It consisted of 18 months of 20 days each, with a final, deeply unlucky 5-day period at the end called the Wayeb, a time when the portals to the underworld were believed to be open. These two calendars were like interlocking gears of different sizes. A specific date, say 4 Ahau 8 Kumku, would not repeat for 52 years. This 52-year cycle, the calendar round, was a sacred block of time, roughly a human lifespan. But for tracking the grand sweep of history, they used a third calendar, the long count. This was a linear calendar that began at a mythical creation date in what corresponds to our August of 3114 BCE. It allowed them to place any event in a vast, unfolding timeline, connecting the reigns of their kings back to the very actions of the gods. This is the calendar that famously caused a great deal of fuss in our own time. The whole 2012 end of the world panic was simply a profound misunderstanding of the long count reaching the end of a major 13 Baktun cycle. For the Maya, it wasn't an apocalypse. It was just the turning over of a cosmic odometer, a moment for immense celebration and renewal, not dread. All of this knowledge, the history, the astronomy, the prophecies, was recorded in their sophisticated writing system. For centuries, scholars believed the intricate Maya glyphs were merely pictographic or symbolic. But thanks to the work of a handful of brilliant researchers in the mid-20th century, we now know it was a true, functioning logosyllabic script, combining signs for whole words with signs for phonetic syllables. A Maya scribe, or AJ Tsib, was a high-status artist and scholar, able to paint these glyphs with a turkey feather brush onto the plaster-coated pages of screenfold books made from the bark of the fig tree. With this flexible system, they could write anything they could say, capturing the nuances of their language. The cracking of the Maya code transformed our view of them, revealing their stone monuments not as hymns to anonymous gods, but as detailed political histories of very real kings and queens, full of ambition, triumph, and intrigue. This complex intellectual framework was the software that ran Maya civilization, the operating system of their reality, and the lens through which they saw their world. If the intricate calendars and hieroglyphs were the sacred software of the Maya world, then the great ritual of the ball game was how they ran the program. It was here, in the heart of the ceremonial center, on a long, eye-shaped court flanked by sloping stone walls, that the abstract concepts of their cosmos were made terrifyingly real. This was not mere sport or entertainment. It was a physical manifestation of their deepest myths, a dangerous and deadly form of political theater, a ritual that had been played across Mesoamerica for thousands of years, from the early Olmec to the later Aztec. To understand the ball game is to understand the dramatic, high-stakes intersection of religion and power in their world. Imagine a holy lord, a Kuhul Ajar, taking his seat atop a temple overlooking the city's main ball court. The sun is high and hot, reflecting off the brightly painted stucco of the court's walls. The air is thick with the scent of burning copal incense and the murmur of the assembled crowd. Nobles, priests, and commoners, all gathered to witness the sacred event. Then the players enter the alley. They are not lean, agile men like modern athletes. They are powerful, thick-set, and heavily protected. They wear massive yokes of leather and cotton around their hips, protective pads on their knees and elbows, and sometimes elaborate headdresses. They are warriors and athletes, but today they are also mythic actors on a cosmic stage. And then comes the other star of the show, the ball, made from the latex of the rubber tree, a substance unknown in Europe. The solid ball could weigh up to 10 pounds. It was heavy, unpredictable, and astonishingly bouncy. The game begins. There are no hands, no feet. The players launch themselves at the hard, heavy ball, twisting their bodies to strike it with their padded hips, thighs, or sometimes their upper arms. They dive across the stone floor, colliding with each other and with the unforgiving walls in a display of breathtaking, brutal acrobatics. The goal is to keep the ball in play, to volley it back and forth, and perhaps to knock it through one of the stone markers or rings set high on the court's walls. Historians and archaeologists still debate the exact rules, which likely varied from place to place and century to century, but the physical demands are obvious. Every impact of the heavy ball on a player's body would leave a deep, agonizing bruise. Broken bones and internal injuries must have been common, but the physical struggle on the court was merely a reflection of a much greater struggle. The ball court itself was a symbolic gateway, a threshold between the world of the living and the underworld of Xibalba. The back and forth motion of the black rubber ball mimicked the daily journey of the sun, moon, and stars, which the Maya believed passed through the underworld each night before being reborn at dawn. The game was a reenactment of the eternal cosmic battle between light and darkness, life and death, order and chaos. The players were not just men. They were embodying the divine forces that kept the universe in balance. This was no abstract metaphor. It was a direct reenactment of their most sacred creation story, the Popol Vuh. In that epic, the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, are summoned to the underworld to play a series of ball games against the malevolent lords of Xibalba. Through cleverness, skill, and sacrifice, the twins ultimately defeat the death gods on the court, a victory that allows for their own resurrection and the eventual creation of the present world. Every ball game played by a Maya king was therefore an echo of this primordial contest, a way of reaffirming the victory of life over death that made their own existence possible. And this brought a terrifying edge to the game, for that mythic victory required a sacrifice. Carved panels on ball courts across Mesoamerica, from El Tajin in the north to Chichen Itza in the south, leave no doubt about the game's ultimate potential outcome. They depict a player on his knees, while another player or a priest stands over him with an obsidian knife, having just decapitated him. From the victim's neck, serpents or vines of life are shown sprouting, symbolizing the regenerative power of this sacred offering. It certainly puts a new perspective on being a sore loser. You thought getting a cooler of sports drink dumped on your head was a bad outcome. For some ritual games, the captain of the losing team, or in some interpretations, the captain of the winning team, as the most worthy offering, was destined for the sacrificial stone. This also made the ball game a potent political tool. A king could use the game to cement his authority and display his power. High-status captives taken in a war might be forced to play a ritual game they were doomed to lose before their public sacrifice. Instead of launching a costly, full-scale war, rival kings could settle disputes or engage in symbolic combat on the ball court. It was a bit like a high-stakes international summit, but with more body armor and a significantly higher chance of the losing delegation not making it home. The game was a spectacle, a prayer, and a political statement all in one. As the final thud of the ball echoed off the stone walls, the ritual would conclude. Cosmic order would be affirmed, the gods would be nourished, and everyone who witnessed it would be left with no doubt as to the power and the piety of their divine king. The sacred ball game, with its violent grace and cosmic stakes, was the ultimate expression of the divine king's power. He was the master of the rituals that kept the universe in balance, the guarantor of the order that separated humanity from chaos. In the 7th and 8th centuries CE, the power of these kings seemed more absolute than ever. In the heartland, Tikal, after its long century of humiliation, had roared back to life. Under the great king Jasor Chan Kawil I, the Jaguar lords defeated their mortal enemies, the Snake Kings of Kalakmul, in a climactic battle in the year 695. The victory ushered in a final blaze of glory for Tikal, a renaissance that saw the construction of its most iconic and breathtaking pyramids, like the Temple of the Great Jaguar, which would serve as the king's own tomb. Across the southern lowlands, the population boomed. Art and writing reached new heights of sophistication, and the ceremonial centers pulsed with a vibrant, seemingly eternal life. This was the peak of the classic Maya world. And then it all began to fall apart. The end did not come with a single dramatic bang, but with a slow, creeping silence. It began in the West around the year 760. In the smaller kingdoms, the tradition of carving the king's deeds onto stone stelae, each one stamped with a precise long count date, simply stopped. A scribe in a city like Piedras Negras carves the last monument his kingdom will ever create, unaware that his chisel is marking the end of an era. Then the silence spreads. The last dated monument at Palenque is 719. At Copan, in the south, it is 822. One by one, like lights going out across a vast circuit board, the cities of the southern lowlands stop recording their own history. They fall silent. For a farmer living in the shadow of a great city, the collapse was not an abstract historical event. It was the slow unraveling of reality itself. The rains, which for generations had come with predictable regularity, became erratic and weak. His maize, the sacred crop that was the stuff of human flesh, withered on its stalk in the cracked, dry earth. The demands of the Holy Lord in the city center did not lessen. If anything, they grew more desperate. More tribute was demanded for more elaborate ceremonies. More labor for building projects meant to placate the angry gods. The low-level warfare that had always simmered between neighboring cities now boiled over into something more vicious and total. As desperate kings fought over scarce resources and dwindling farmland, the farmer saw the promises of his divine king fail, one by one. The rituals no longer brought rain. The battles no longer brought victory. The entire cosmic bargain that his ancestors had lived by for 1,000 years was broken, and in his stone palace, the Holy Lord himself feels his power, once as solid as the pyramids he commanded, turn to dust. He lets his own sacred blood, the most precious offering he can give. He presides over the sacrifice of high-status captives. He consults the calendar priests, who frantically search their books for an explanation, a solution. But nothing works. The gods are silent. The faith of his people begins to curdle into resentment and despair. It's a tough position for a divine king when the divine perks package, rain, good harvests, military wins, gets cancelled. Suddenly, the job doesn't seem so glamorous anymore. For over a century, archaeologists have been searching for the single cause of this great collapse. But the truth is far more complex. There was no one cause. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm of calamities that fed on each other. The leading culprit, supported by a growing mountain of evidence from lake bed sediments and cave stalagmites, is climate change. A series of prolonged and severe droughts struck the region, particularly during the 9th century, precisely when the collapse was accelerating. This environmental shock fell upon a society that was already dangerously overstretched. Centuries of population growth and intensive farming had led to widespread deforestation and soil erosion, making the agricultural system incredibly vulnerable. The endless, escalating warfare between the city-states fractured the political landscape, making any large-scale, coordinated response to the crisis impossible. The entire system had lost its resilience, so people began to leave. It wasn't a panicked flight, but a slow, heartbreaking exodus. Families simply packed what they could and walked away from the fields their ancestors had farmed for 30 generations. The artisans' workshops fell silent. The bustling markets grew empty. Finally, even the royal courts dissolved, the holy lords and their retinues vanishing from the historical record. The great plazas, which had once thronged with thousands of people for religious festivals, were now eerily quiet, home only to the wind. The jungle, which had always waited patiently at the edge of the maize fields, began its slow, inexorable work of reclamation. It is crucial to understand that this was not the end of the Maya people. It was the collapse of a specific political system, the institution of divine kingship in a specific geographical area, the southern lowlands. The people did not vanish from the face of the earth. Many likely died from starvation or conflict, but many others migrated, moving north and into the highlands, carrying their culture and their language with them. And as the southern cities were being consumed by vines, a new chapter for the Maya was already beginning in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. There, cities like Uxmal and Chichen Itza were not collapsing. They were rising, reaching their peak of power and influence. The silent, vine-choked ruins of Tikal and Calakmul would become places of legend, their great kings forgotten, their secrets guarded by stone and jungle for 1,000 years. The center of the Mesoamerican world was about to shift once more, as the last royal courts of the southern Maya kings dissolved into the encroaching jungle. A profound power vacuum was created. The collapse of the classic Maya order ended an era. But to understand the forces that would rush in to fill that void, the ideas and powers that would shape the next chapter of Mesoamerican history, we must leave the silent, vine-choked ruins of the Petén. We must travel not only across a great distance, but also back in time, to the cool, thin air of the central Mexican highlands, to a city of giants whose influence was felt for centuries, even in the faraway courts of Tikal and Copan. We are going to a place the Aztecs, finding it in ruins 1,000 years after its fall, would name Teotihuacan, the birthplace of the gods. The first and most important thing to understand about Teotihuacan is its profound mystery. We do not know what its people called themselves. We are not certain what language they spoke. We do not know what they called their own magnificent city. The name we use is a ghost name, an echo given to it by a later culture awestruck by its scale. The original builders are a people without a known name, a civilization whose voice we cannot hear directly. They left behind no grand historical texts like the Maya, no stelae boasting of a king's conquests. Their story must be read in the stones of their city, in the layout of their streets, and in their strange, impersonal art. The city rose in the Valley of Mexico, a high-altitude basin that would one day be the heart of the Aztec Empire. Around the time of the birth of Christ, while the Maya were just beginning to build their first great centers in the jungle, Teotihuacan exploded onto the scene. Its growth was fueled by a fortunate combination of rich agricultural land, control of valuable obsidian sources, and a timely volcanic eruption nearby that displaced thousands of people, many of whom flooded into this new, promising city. By 100 CE, it was well on its way to becoming the first true metropolis in the Americas, a magnet for farmers, artisans, and merchants from across the land. An immigrant or a visiting dignitary arriving at Teotihuacan in the year 400 would have been utterly overwhelmed, not just by its size, but by its rigid, overwhelming order. This was not a city that had grown organically over time. It had been planned and executed on a breathtakingly grand scale. The entire city, which would eventually house over 100,000 people, was laid out on a strict grid, aligned with celestial observations. The San Juan River, which flowed through the valley, was forcibly rerouted and canalized to conform to the city's grid. It was the ultimate expression of top-down urban planning, probably designed by someone who really hated a crooked street. The visitor would have been funneled onto the city's main artery, a vast ceremonial road that the Aztecs would later misname the Avenue of the Dead. It was a grand processional way, over 100 feet wide in places, running for more than a mile and a half, flanked on both sides by the walls of temples and elite palaces. Walking along this avenue, an individual would feel small, anonymous, and humbled, a mere cog in a vast, powerful, and inhumanly orderly machine. Halfway along its length, the avenue was dominated by a structure of almost unbelievable size, the Pyramid of the Sun. It is a thing of pure, brutal mass, a man-made mountain of earth and stone rising over 200 feet high from a base as wide as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Beneath its center, archaeologists discovered a natural lava tube cave, which the builders enlarged and incorporated into the pyramid's design. This cave was likely seen as a sacred place of origin, a womb from which the first humans or gods emerged, making the Pyramid of the Sun the absolute spiritual center of their universe. At the northern terminus of the avenue, the visitor's gaze would be drawn to the Pyramid of the Moon, its elegant form perfectly framed against the backdrop of the sacred mountain behind it, Cerro Gordo, blurring the line between human and divine architecture. We now know that this pyramid was built in 7 successive stages, and that its construction was sanctified by horrific acts of sacrifice. Tombs within it have revealed the remains of both humans and animals, jaguars, pumas, eagles, and serpents, all ritually killed and buried. This was the grim stage for the state's religious theater. Near the city's center, within a vast sunken square called the Citadel, stood the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. Its facade was a stunning and terrifying display, covered with hundreds of huge, projecting carved heads. One, a serpent with a collar of feathers, the other, a goggle-eyed being with a fanged mouth, perhaps an early version of the storm god, Tlaloc. And beneath this temple, another secret was unearthed, a mass grave containing the bodies of more than 100 individuals, most likely warriors, their hands tied behind their backs, sacrificed all at once to dedicate this fearsome building. But for all this power, the rulers themselves remained hidden. Teotihuacan's public art is standardized, abstract, and anonymous. There are murals of priestly figures in elaborate costumes, processions of warriors, and depictions of their great gods. But there are no portraits of individual kings. This anonymity is one of the city's greatest riddles. Historians still argue whether Teotihuacan was ruled by a single, powerful king who, for ideological reasons, chose not to glorify himself, or by a more corporate, anonymous council of elites from different powerful families. It's as if the entire government was run from behind a curtain. With no one wanting their face on the currency, this silent, orderly, and deeply intimidating city was the other superpower of the classic period. And its influence, as we have already seen, would change the destiny of kingdoms hundreds of miles away. To stand atop the Pyramid of the Sun and look down is to see two different cities. The first is the one we have already met, the City of the Gods, a monumental axis of temples and pyramids designed to awe and intimidate, a landscape of overwhelming power ruled by a silent, faceless authority. But if you look beyond that ceremonial core, out into the vast, sprawling grid of the city proper, you see the second Teotihuacan, the city of people. And it is here, in the spaces where the 100,000 inhabitants of this metropolis lived, worked, and worshipped, that we find a way of life utterly distinct from anything else in ancient America. While a Maya farmer lived in a simple, perishable hut in a village scattered around the ceremonial center, the average citizen of Teotihuacan lived in a large, single-story, stone and plaster apartment compound. These were remarkable structures. From the street, they presented a high, blank, windowless wall, creating a sense of privacy and defense. But once you passed through the single entrance, you would find yourself in a complex of open-air patios, porticoed corridors, and individual family apartments. These compounds were shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of related people, creating a tight-knit community within the larger city. Sunlight streamed into the central courtyards where daily life unfolded, the rhythmic grinding of maize on a stone metate, the chatter of women weaving textiles, the shouts of children playing a game. It was a bit like a modern condominium complex, but with more vibrant murals and significantly more ritual sacrifice in the main plaza. This was a city of immigrants, a true cosmopolitan center, and the city's planners were sophisticated enough to accommodate them, allowing distinct ethnic enclaves or barrios to flourish. On the western side of the city was a large neighborhood of people from the Zapotec kingdom of Monte Alban, far to the south in Oaxaca. A Zapotec merchant, returning to Teotihuacan after a long journey, could come home to a place where his own language was spoken. He would see pottery made in the familiar Oaxacan style. He would worship at shrines dedicated to Zapotec deities, and when he died, he would be buried in a stone-lined tomb identical to those in his ancestral homeland. For generations, this community maintained its distinct identity, a testament to the city's surprisingly multicultural fabric. Elsewhere, Archaeologists have found a merchant's barrio with artifacts and circular temples in the style of the Gulf Coast, and clear evidence of high status Maya nobles living at least for a time within the city, confirming the deep connections between these two great powers. The economic engine that drove this incredible urban experiment and funded its massive building projects was a glassy, black volcanic rock. Obsidian. Teotihuacan controlled the sources of the finest obsidian in Mesoamerica, especially the unique green obsidian from Pachuca, whose beautiful translucent sheen made it a prized luxury good. Within the city, there were more than 400 separate workshops dedicated to the mass production of obsidian tools. In these districts, the ground is still thick with millions of razor-sharp flakes. Here, a craftsman would sit, and with a skill passed down through generations, he would take a prepared obsidian core and with a few precise pressures, peel off a prismatic blade so thin its edge was only a few molecules thick, far sharper than any metal razor. These blades, along with millions of spear points and knives, were the city's primary export. This was not craft production. This was an industry. These goods, along with the city's iconic thin orange ware pottery, were traded across a network that spanned 1,000 miles. Teotihuacan's power was projected not necessarily by marching armies, but by its far-reaching commercial influence. The exact nature of this power is still debated by scholars. Was it a true territorial empire that demanded tribute from conquered provinces, or was it a commercial hegemon that dominated through the control of markets and trade routes? The truth is likely a mix of both. We know they established military outposts to protect their trade routes, and their intervention in Tikal was hardly a simple business trip. But for the most part, their presence in distant lands was felt through the arrival of their merchants and the desirability of their goods. Back within the city, the diverse population of Zapotecs, locals, and merchants from all corners of the land were bound together by a powerful civic and religious ideology, an identity that was reinforced daily by the art that surrounded them. The inner walls of the apartment compounds were covered in stunning polychrome murals. Unlike Maya art, these paintings did not celebrate the lives of kings. Instead, they depicted a pantheon of powerful deities and the elaborate rituals dedicated to them. The two stars of this divine pantheon were the goggle-eyed storm god, a precursor to the Aztec Tlaloc, who brought the life-giving rain, but also the destructive lightning, and a mysterious female deity now known as the Great Goddess. Often depicted as a fanged, spider-like being, she seems to have been a primordial creator goddess, a source of life, fertility, and the underworld. It's a testament to good interior design. When you have no windows, you might as well cover the walls with vibrant paintings of your city's most important deities. It certainly beats staring at beige plaster. This shared art and religion created a powerful social glue, uniting the city's many different peoples into a single, cohesive, and remarkably stable society that would dominate the heart of Mexico for centuries. For 5 centuries, the city of Teotihuacan stood as the unshakable center of the Mesoamerican world. Its influence radiated for hundreds of miles. Its merchants traveled every major trade route. Its pottery was coveted in the palaces of Maya kings, and its sheer scale suggested a power that was eternal. a society engineered for 1,000 years of dominance. But no eternal city has ever been built. And unlike the slow, creeping decline that emptied the Maya cities of the south, Teotihuacan's end was not a quiet fading. It was a sudden, violent, and fiery cataclysm. Sometime around the year 550 CE, a resident of a quiet apartment compound on the city's periphery would have woken to a terrifying sight. The sky above the city's sacred heart was black with smoke, and a hellish orange glow pulsed against the clouds. The sound of chaos, of shouting, and the splintering of massive wooden beams would have echoed through the gridded streets. The avenue of the dead was burning, the temples of the gods and the palaces of the unseen lords, the very symbols of the city's cosmic power, were engulfed in flames so intense they would turn the stone walls red and cause the thick plaster floors to crack and shatter. This was not an accident, a stray spark from a cooking fire. This was a deliberate and systematic act of destruction. Archaeologists, digging through the layers of ash and debris, have pieced together the story of that terrible day. The great wooden doors of the temples were smashed in. The sacred precincts were looted. Statues of the gods were dragged from their pedestals and shattered. Elite tombs were broken into and desecrated. The destruction was not random. It was targeted with surgical precision at the buildings and objects that represented the power and ideology of the Teotihuacan state. It was the most extreme form of urban renewal imaginable, a clear message to the ruling class that their lease had been terminated. With extreme prejudice, the question that has haunted historians ever since is, who held the torch? This is one of the great unsolved mysteries of Mesoamerican history. For a long time, the prevailing theory was that the city was sacked by external enemies, perhaps new, ambitious city-states on the edges of Teotihuacan's sphere of influence, like Cacaxtla or Xochicalco, had formed an alliance to destroy their overlord. Or maybe it was the work of nomadic warrior groups from the arid north, the people the Aztecs would later lump together under the name Chichimeca, who swept down to plunder the wealthy but perhaps decadent metropolis. But a growing body of evidence points to a more shocking culprit. The people of Teotihuacan themselves. The attack's laser-like focus on the ceremonial core, while leaving many of the residential compounds relatively untouched, strongly suggests an inside job. This may have been a violent internal revolution, an uprising of the city's massive and anonymous population against its rigid, oppressive, and faceless rulers. Perhaps, just as in the Maya lands, a period of prolonged drought had caused crop failures and famine, when the offerings and rituals performed by the priests in the Great Pyramids failed to bring rain. The social contract was broken. The gods had failed the people, or the rulers had failed the gods. The fury of a hungry and disillusioned populace may have been unleashed upon the symbols of the very system that had let them down. The question of who burned Teotihuacan is a classic archaeological whodunit. Scholars still fiercely debate whether the city fell to foreign invaders or whether it was torn apart by its own internal contradictions. The most likely answer is probably a messy combination of both. A city weakened by internal strife, becoming a ripe target for opportunistic outsiders. In the aftermath, Teotihuacan was a ghost of its former self, A smaller, poorer population clung on for a time, living among the blackened ruins, but the central authority was gone forever. The workshops that had mass-produced obsidian blades fell silent. The sophisticated irrigation systems that fed the city fell into disrepair. The great city was broken. Its collapse sent shockwaves across the entire Mesoamerican world. The fall of Teotihuacan was like the collapse of a star, creating a massive gravitational vacuum. For 500 years, it had been the primary hub of trade, the arbiter of style, and the ultimate source of political prestige. Now, that center was gone. The centuries that followed the fall of Teotihuacan are known as the Epiclassic period. It was a time of chaos, fragmentation, and brutal competition. With the big cat away, all the regional mice came out to play. Suddenly, every local lord with a decent-sized pyramid and a few hundred warriors thought he had what it took to be the next big thing. Dozens of smaller cities, many of them built on easily defensible hilltops, now vied for control of the fractured trade routes and the legacy of the fallen giant. It was a darker, more militaristic age. The art of this period is filled with images of warriors, battles, and the sacrifice of captives. The era of the two great superpowers, the anonymous council of Teotihuacan in the highlands and the divine kings of the Maya lowlands, was now truly over. One ending in a spreading silence, the other in a roar of flame. From the ashes of these two great classic civilizations, a new and more turbulent world was about to be born. Out of the smoking ruins of Teotihuacan and the silent plazas of the fallen Maya kingdoms, a new and turbulent era was born. For several centuries, the Mesoamerican world was a fractured landscape of competing city-states. In the central highlands, ambitious warlords built new capitals on fortified hilltops. Centers like Xochicalco and Cacaxtla, whose stunning murals are a testament to this age of intense warfare and shifting alliances. There was no single, dominant power, only a constant, simmering struggle. But out of this crucible of conflict, a new people began to consolidate their strength. A people who would claim the mantle of the fallen giants of Teotihuacan, and whose legacy would be so powerful that all who came after them would claim them as ancestors. These were the Toltecs. Their capital, which they called Tolan, we know today as Tula. It was established around 900 CE, not in the lush heart of the Valley of Mexico, but further north, on a defensible ridge in a drier, more rugged frontier zone. The Toltecs themselves were a fusion of peoples, a mix of settled agriculturalists descended from the remnants of Teotihuacan's civilization, and fierce, semi-nomadic Chichimec warrior bands who had migrated down from the northern deserts. This blend of ancient, urban sophistication and raw, frontier militarism would define their character and their destiny. The story of Tula is wrapped in a dense web of myth, centered on its most famous and perhaps legendary ruler. His name was Che-Acatl Topiltzin, but he was the high priest of a powerful religious cult, and so he took the name of the deity he served, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. This was the same ancient god whose image had been carved onto the temples of Teotihuacan, a deity of creation, learning, and civilization. The legends paint Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl as a wise and pious king who brought a golden age to Tula. He encouraged the arts, opposed the practice of human sacrifice, and taught his people the secrets of the calendar and the stars. But this peaceful, priestly vision for the Toltec state was not unopposed. His rival, both in myth and likely in the political reality of Tula, was a powerful faction devoted to a very different god, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. He was a capricious and terrifying deity of sorcery, darkness, and war, a patron of the warrior cults who demanded sacrifice. The struggle between these two forces is the central drama of Toltec history. It was the classic struggle between the art department and the football team for control of the school. And at Tula, the football team definitely won. According to the legend, Tezcatlipoca and his followers used trickery and black magic to disgrace the pure Quetzalcoatl. They held up a mirror to his face, showing him his own aging, human features, filling him with vanity. They then got him drunk on pulque, the fermented agave wine, and tricked him into sleeping with his own sister, violating his sacred vows of celibacy. Shamed and defeated, Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl was driven out of his own capital. He fled Tula, traveling eastward toward the Gulf of Mexico. There, on the coast, some legends say he built a raft of serpents and sailed away into the east, vowing that he would one day return in the year of his birth on the sacred calendar, the year Se Acatl, or one reed, to reclaim his throne. This prophecy of the returning king would be passed down for 500 years, a sleeping memory in the consciousness of Mesoamerica, waiting for a fateful day when it would have catastrophic consequences. After the faction of the feathered serpent was exiled, Tula was remade in the image of the smoking mirror. It became a city of warriors. The art and architecture of this new Toltec state is a grim and powerful testament to their ideology. The most iconic feature of Tula is found atop their main pyramid. 4 colossal, 15-foot-tall statues of Toltec warriors carved from basalt. These are the famous Atlantean figures. They are not portraits of individual rulers, but identical, anonymous soldiers, their faces stern and implacable, wearing feathered headdresses and butterfly pectorals, and clutching their primary weapon, the deadly atlatl, or spear thrower. Surrounding the temples were other chilling decorations: a serpent wall, carved with images of snakes devouring skeletons, and stone friezes depicting processions of eagles, jaguars, and coyotes, all shown feasting on human hearts. The message was unambiguous. This was a state built on military might and nourished by human sacrifice. For the Aztecs, who rose to power centuries later, the Toltecs were the giants of the past, the source of all legitimate power and civilized knowledge. They looked back on Tula as a lost paradise, a city of flawless artisans and unimaginable wealth. For the Aztecs, the Toltecs were the good old days personified. They imagined everything the Toltecs made was perfect, their featherwork sublime, their corn cobs gigantic. It was a serious case of ancestor worship/nostalgia, the Mesoamerican equivalent of thinking everyone in a bygone era dressed perfectly and had flawless manners. This has created a challenge for modern archaeologists, known as the Toltec problem. Historians fiercely debate the true extent of the Toltec Empire. Was it a vast, centralized state that controlled Mesoamerica, as the Aztec legends claim? Or was its power more symbolic, its reputation and influence later inflated by the Aztecs, who were desperate to write themselves a noble pedigree. The archaeological evidence suggests Tula was a powerful and influential city, but perhaps not the continent-spanning empire of later legend. Regardless, their influence was real and would be felt far beyond the highlands, in a place where another great civilization was in the midst of a dramatic transformation. When the shamed priest-king Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl was driven from his capital at Tula, the legends say he traveled east toward the rising sun and the great waters of the Gulf of Mexico. For centuries, this story was just a myth, a poignant tale of a lost golden age. But archaeology has a funny way of finding echoes of myths in the earth. To follow the trail of the feathered serpent, we must leave the dry highlands of the Toltecs and journey across the Gulf to the flat, sun-drenched limestone shelf of the northern Yucatan Peninsula. This was the region of the Maya world that had not collapsed, while Tikal and Palenque were being swallowed by the jungle. The cities of the north were thriving, and one, in particular, was about to undergo a radical transformation that would make it the new master of the Maya world. Its name was Chichen Itza, the mouth of the well of the Itza. The world of the northern Yucatan is a world without rivers. The porous limestone bedrock swallows the rainfall, creating a vast underground network of caves and rivers. The only access to this fresh water is through natural sinkholes, or cenotes, where the limestone roof has collapsed, creating deep, circular wells that were seen as sacred portals to the underworld. Life here was tethered to these cenotes, and Chichen Itza grew up around two of the largest. It had long been a locally important city, but around the same time that Tula was flourishing in the west, something new and powerful arrived at Chichen Itza. A new art style, a new architectural plan, a new religious cult, and a new, more aggressive military ideology appeared. And they were all unmistakably in the style of the Toltecs. The result was a fascinating cultural mashup, like a blockbuster movie directed by a Maya filmmaker, but starring Toltec action heroes. The language and the people were Maya, but the city was reborn with a Toltec face. The most stunning expression of this fusion is the city's central pyramid, a monument so iconic it is known today simply as El Castillo, the castle. The Maya of Chichen Itza, however, knew it as the Temple of Kukulkan. Kukulkan is the direct translation of Quetzalcoatl into the Yucatec Maya language. This was the temple of the feathered serpent. It is a masterpiece of architectural symbolism, a four-sided pyramid of sublime proportions. It is, in effect, a giant stone calendar. Each of its four stairways has 91 steps, which, when added together with the single step of the top platform, equals 365. The days of the solar year, twice a year, on the spring and autumn equinoxes. As the sun sets, a play of light and shadow creates the illusion of a massive serpent undulating down the pyramid's main staircase. El Castillo is basically a giant solar-powered day planner, designed to remind you of important dates and, twice a year, put on a really cool shadow puppet show. The Toltec influence becomes even more explicit at the Temple of the Warriors. Here, a vast colonnaded hall is fronted by hundreds of square columns, each carved on all four sides with a life-sized portrait of a Toltec warrior in full battle regalia. They are virtual copies of the warriors depicted at Tula, hundreds of miles away. Nearby stands a feature rarely seen in the classic Maya world, but common in central Mexico. At Tzompantli, a large platform whose walls are carved with row upon row of human skulls impaled on stakes. The Great Ball Court, the largest in all of Mesoamerica, tells a similar story. Its scale is monumental, and its stone reliefs depict players in a mix of Maya and Toltec styles, with a gruesome panel showing the captain of one team being decapitated, a torrent of blood transforming into serpents. How did this happen? How did a Maya city come to look so much like the distant Toltec capital? The exact nature of the Toltec presence at Chichen Itza remains a hot topic of debate. The traditional view, supported by the legends, is that Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl and his followers actually arrived in the Yucatan, conquered the city, and established themselves as a new ruling class. But a more recent theory suggests a less direct process. Perhaps the rising lords of Chichen Itza, savvy politicians in a new, competitive world, saw the power and prestige of the Toltecs and decided to actively emulate them. They may have invited Toltec artisans and mercenaries into their city, adopted their warrior cults, and used the symbolism of the powerful feathered serpent to legitimize their own expansionist ambitions. It might not have been a foreign conquest so much as a brilliant and strategic cultural and political rebranding. Whatever the mechanism, the result was a powerful cosmopolitan state that dominated the northern Yucatan for over 200 years. Pilgrims from all over the Maya world came to its temples. Its power was felt not only in its armies, but in its sacred geography. The city's main cenote, the great sacred cenote, was not a source of drinking water. It was a place of sacrifice, a gaping mouth into which offerings were thrown to appease the rain god, Chayak. Early 20th century dredging of this well brought up a treasure trove of artifacts, gold bells, jade plaques, and fine pottery, along with the skeletal remains of hundreds of individuals, confirming the grim reality behind the pilgrims' prayers. For a time, Chichen Itza was the undisputed center of the Maya world, a hybrid city whose unique blend of local tradition and foreign militarism created a new and formidable power in the wake of the Great Collapse. While the great dramas of the Maya, the Teotihuacanos, and the Toltecs played out, a third parallel story was unfolding in the rugged, mountainous south. Our journey now takes us to the valley of Oaxaca, a region of stunning biological and cultural diversity, a place that would give rise to its own unique and enduring civilizations. Here, in these fertile, Y-shaped valleys nestled between high mountain ranges, another tradition of kingship, writing, and city building flourished for well over 1,000 years, largely on its own terms. This is the story of the Zapotecs, the Cloud People, and their artistic successors, the Mixtecs. For centuries, the valley floor was dotted with small, competing farming communities. But around 500 BCE, at roughly the same time the Olmec were fading and the first giant pyramids of the pre-classic Maya were rising, the peoples of Oaxaca did something extraordinary. They chose to build a new, unified capital, a symbol of their collective power. But they did not build it on the fertile, easily accessible valley floor. Instead, they went up. They chose a jagged 1,300-foot tall mountain that stood at the very center of the three arms of the valley. And over the course of generations, They leveled its summit, hauling millions of tons of rock and earth to create a vast artificial acropolis in the sky. This was Monte Alban. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in Mesoamerica, a testament to a newfound political unity and a powerful statement that they were now the masters of their world. The earliest stone monuments carved at this new capital offer a chilling glimpse into the foundation of Zapotec power. Lining one of the main buildings are more than 300 stone slabs, each depicting a life-sized, contorted, naked figure. For a long time, these carvings were known as the danzantes, or the dancers, because of their writhing poses. This is a very optimistic take. Scholars now agree that these are almost certainly grim portraits of slain and mutilated enemy chieftains, their closed eyes signifying death, their nakedness a sign of ultimate humiliation, and the scrolling symbols near their groins likely indicating ritual disembowelment. From its very beginning, Monte Alban's welcome sign was less, "Come on in and dance," and more, "This is what happens to our enemies." For the next millennium, Monte Alban reigned as the undisputed capital of the Zapotec state. From their mountaintop acropolis, its rulers oversaw a kingdom that controlled the entire valley and beyond. They developed one of the earliest writing systems in Mesoamerica, a hieroglyphic script that is still only partially deciphered. They built elegant temples, sunken patios, a ball court, and a curious arrow-shaped building that functioned as an astronomical observatory. And they were major players on the international stage. As we saw, there was a whole neighborhood of Zapotec diplomats and merchants living in far-off Teotihuacan. And in turn, carvings at Monte Alban depict ambassadors from Teotihuacan in their distinctive garb, arriving to negotiate with the Zapotec lords. They were not a colony, but a respected rival power. But like all the great classic era states, Monte Alban's centralized power eventually waned. Around 800 CE, the great Acropolis was slowly abandoned as a political capital, its population dispersing to smaller centers back on the valley floor. The Zapotec people and their culture endured, but their grand unified state had fractured. This political vacuum allowed a new group to rise to prominence in the region, the Mixtecs. The Mixtecs, who came from the highlands to the west of the valley, were not builders of massive new cities. Their genius lay in a smaller, more refined scale. They were, arguably, the most accomplished artists and craftspeople in all of ancient Mesoamerica. Where the Zapotecs had written their history on stone monuments, the Mixtecs wrote theirs in beautiful screenfold books, or codices, made of cured deerskin and coated with a fine layer of plaster. In these precious books, which are among the only pre-Hispanic manuscripts to survive, Mixtec scribes painted vibrant, detailed histories of their royal lineages, wars, marriages, and religious beliefs. They were also masters of working in gold and turquoise, using techniques like lost wax casting to create jewelry of breathtaking intricacy. If Mesoamerica had a high-end designer brand, it would have been Mixtec. Their codices were the history books, and their goldwork was the bling. The greatest testament to their artistry and their reverence for the past was found not in one of their own cities, but back at the old, abandoned Zapotec capital. Long after its original builders had left, the Mixtecs regarded Monte Alban as a sacred ancestral site. Here, in 1932, The Mexican archaeologist Alfonso Caso discovered an old Zapotec tomb, Tomb 7, that had been reused centuries later for the burial of a group of Mixtec nobles. The contents were staggering. It was the richest treasure trove ever unearthed in Mesoamerica. Hundreds of objects of gold, silver, amber, jade, turquoise, and intricately carved animal bones. There were golden pectorals depicting jaguar knights, a rock crystal goblet, and a human skull exquisitely decorated with a mosaic of turquoise and shell. This single tomb revealed the sheer wealth and unparalleled artistry of the Mixtec lords. The Zapotecs had built the great stage, but it was the Mixtecs who would adorn it with Mesoamerica's finest jewels. As the Toltec-inspired lords of Chichen Itza ruled the north and the Mixtec masters of jewelry and manuscripts held sway in the south, the post-classic world saw the rise of yet another great power, this one in a region we have not yet visited. We travel now to the west, to the lush, pine-clad volcanic highlands of modern Michoacan. This is a land of beautiful, high-altitude lakes, a landscape that fostered a civilization so distinct, so powerful, and so confident in its own identity that it would become the only state to stand against the full might of the Aztec Empire and never break. These were the people who called themselves the Purepecha, though we know them in history by the name their enemies gave them, the Tarascans. Their uniqueness begins with their language. The Purepecha language is an isolate, meaning it is completely unrelated to any other known language in Mesoamerica. While the Toltecs and later the Aztecs spoke Nahuatl, and the peoples of Oaxaca and the Maya lands spoke their own ancient tongues, the Purepecha spoke a language that was a total mystery to their neighbors. It was the ancient equivalent of everyone on your block speaking one language, and you're speaking something completely different, leaving the mailman utterly confused. This linguistic island hints at a deep and independent history. Their own origin stories tell of a migration of a semi-nomadic group, the Uakusecha, into the beautiful basin of Lake Pátzcuaro. There, under the leadership of their legendary founding hero, Tariakuri, they conquered and unified the diverse peoples living on the lake shores, forging a powerful and centralized kingdom. Their capital, overlooking the shimmering waters of the lake, was the city of Tzintzuntzan, the place of the hummingbirds, and its architecture was as unique as their language. Instead of the massive, four-sided pyramids common to the rest of Mesoamerica, the Tarascans built their temples upon strange and elegant platforms known as yacatas. These structures had a unique keyhole shape, with a long, rectangular section leading to a circular one. A row of 5 of these gleaming white yacatas once stood on the grand ceremonial platform at Tzintzuntzan, their rounded temples dedicated to the gods of their distinct pantheon, a group of deities led not by a feathered serpent, but by a powerful fire god named Curicaweri. But the Tarascans' greatest advantage, the thing that truly set them apart and made them a formidable military power, was their mastery of metal. While the Mixtecs were creating exquisite jewelry from gold and silver, the Tarascans were practical metallurgists. They were one of the only civilizations in Mesoamerica to develop true bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was far harder and more durable than pure copper. and they used it for more than just bells and tweezers. They forged bronze into practical tools, axes, fishhooks, and needles, and most importantly, into weapons. A Tarascan army went into battle with bronze axe heads and spear points, a significant technological advantage against enemies whose best weapons were clubs edged with brittle obsidian. For all their political complexity and artistic skill, the Tarascan state is notable for what it lacked. They never developed a system of hieroglyphic writing, preserving their histories and genealogies through rich and detailed oral traditions instead. They built no great ball courts in the style of their neighbors. Their entire cultural package, their language, their gods, their architecture, their technology, was a unique development, a proud and separate stream of Mesoamerican civilization. By the 15th century, this powerful kingdom had consolidated its control over western Mexico, creating a true empire. At the exact same time, another empire, one we have not yet formally met, was rising with ferocious speed in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec Triple Alliance. As the Aztecs expanded relentlessly in all directions, a collision was inevitable. On their western frontier, the unstoppable force of the Aztec war machine met the immovable object of the Tarascan state. The Aztec armies, accustomed to victory, launched several major invasions into Tarascan territory. Every single one was repulsed. The climactic confrontation came around 1479, when an enormous Aztec army, led by one of their most powerful emperors, was utterly annihilated by the Tarascan military. The combination of a unified command, a well-defended frontier, and the technological edge of bronze weapons was something the Aztecs simply could not overcome. You can imagine the Aztec generals returning to their emperor, saying, "Well, we tried invading again. Turns out, bronze axes are really effective against our guys." It must have been a frustrating report to file. This decisive victory established a heavily fortified and remarkably stable border between the two great empires. It was one of the very few places on the map where the relentless Aztec expansion was brought to a dead halt. For the last decades before the arrival of the Spanish, these two superpowers would glare at each other across this frontier, engaged in a kind of Cold War. Their enmity so deep that when strangers from another world arrived, the Tarascans would refuse to join any alliance with the Aztecs against them. They were a proud, independent power, a kingdom of bronze and fire that had forged its own destiny. In the turbulent world that followed the collapse of the great classic civilizations, the central highlands of Mexico were a patchwork of proud, competing city-states. The memory of the Toltecs was a source of immense prestige, and every petty king and warlord claimed them as ancestors to justify their rule. Into this crowded, arrogant, and dangerous landscape, sometime in the 13th century, a new group arrived. They were a poor, bedraggled, semi-nomadic tribe who spoke the Nahuatl language of the Toltecs, but had little of their famed sophistication. They were latecomers, and the established kingdoms of the Valley of Mexico looked upon them with contempt. When the Mexica showed up, the local powers looked at them like you might look at a group of squatters setting up camp in a public park. They were the embarrassing, uncivilized relatives nobody wanted to invite to the party. These were the people who would one day be known to the world as the Aztecs, but they called themselves the Mexica. Their own legends told of a long and arduous journey that had begun centuries before in a mythical ancestral homeland far to the north, a place they called Aztlan, the place of whiteness. The exact location of Aztlan remains a profound mystery. Historians still debate whether it was a real place in the deserts of northern Mexico or the American Southwest, or a purely symbolic landscape of origin. From this lost paradise, the Mexica began a generational pilgrimage, guided by the relentless voice of their patron deity, a fierce and demanding tribal god of war, and the sun named Huitzilopochtli, or hummingbird on the left. The priests, carrying the idol of the god in a sacred bundle, would receive his commands, pushing his chosen people onward through years of hardship, promising them a glorious destiny at the end of their wanderings. When they finally arrived in the fertile valley of Mexico, they found that all the good land was already taken. They were seen as provincial upstarts and were shunted from one miserable patch of territory to another, serving as vassals and mercenaries for the powerful city-states that ringed the great Lake Texcoco. Their reputation for being both formidable warriors and uncouth barbarians was cemented by a particularly gruesome incident. After serving the powerful city of Culhuacan, the Mexica were granted a decree of favor. The lord of Culhuacan offered his daughter in marriage to one of the Mexica leaders, an act that would have created a powerful alliance and elevated the Mexica to noble status. The Mexica accepted, announcing that the princess would be transformed into a goddess. The lord of Culhuacan arrived to attend the ceremony, only to be met by a Mexica priest dancing in the flayed skin of his beloved daughter. For the Mexica, this was the ultimate offering to Huitzilopochtli. For the Culhuacanos, it was an act of unthinkable horror. They furiously drove the Mexica from their lands, chasing them into the marshes of the lake. Friendless, despised, and with nowhere left to go, the Mexica took refuge on a cluster of swampy, snake-infested, and thoroughly undesirable islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And it was here, in this bleak and muddy exile, in the year the Christian world called 1325, that their priests saw the sign their God had promised them for centuries. On a small, rocky outcrop, they beheld a great eagle, its feathers shining in the sun, perched atop a prickly pear cactus. Clutched firmly in its talons and beak was a writhing serpent. This was the prophecy fulfilled. Their long journey was over. Huitzilopochtli had shown them their promised land. The divine real estate advice was, on the surface, questionable at best. Huitzilopochtli had pointed them to a soggy marsh that nobody else wanted. It was the ultimate fixer-upper, a place that would require centuries of relentless labor and brilliant engineering to become a viable city. But for the Mexica, it was a sanctuary and a fortress. Here, surrounded by the protective waters of the lake, they could finally build their own community. They named their new home Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. It began humbly as a small collection of reed and mud huts, a far cry from the magnificent stone cities of their neighbors. Their early years were spent consolidating their island, learning to survive in their unique aquatic environment, and continuing to pay tribute and serve as hired muscle for the true superpower of the valley. The Teotihuacan Empire ruled from the nearby city of Azcapotzalco. The wandering tribe now had a home, but they were still a long way from being masters of their own destiny. They were biding their time, gathering their strength, their fierce god, whispering promises of the empire that was to come. The eagle had landed, and from this muddy island, a city of unimaginable splendor was about to rise. For nearly a century after the founding of their improbable city, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan played the part of the loyal, if fearsome, vassal. They lived under the thumb of the true superpower in the Valley of Mexico. The Tepanec Empire ruled from the mighty city of Azcapotzalco. The Mexica paid heavy tribute to their Tepanec overlords. Woven cloth, agricultural goods, and, most importantly, their service as ferocious mercenaries in the Tepanec armies. They fought and bled to expand their master's empire, and in doing so, they learned the arts of statecraft and warfare, all while quietly growing their own city, raising their own children, and nursing a deep-seated resentment in the defensible heart of their island fortress. They were biding their time, waiting for the moment when the student would be ready to challenge the master. That moment arrived in the year 1426, with the death of the ancient and powerful Tepanec tyrant, Teotihuacan. His long reign had held the empire together through sheer force of will, but his passing created an immediate power vacuum. The death of a long reigning tyrant is always a tricky moment. His son, Maxtla, took the throne, but he lacked his father's political skill and ruled with a paranoid brutality, attempting to crush any hint of dissent. He assassinated the rulers of rival cities and tried to clamp down even harder on the increasingly powerful Mexica. This was a fatal miscalculation. In Tenochtitlan, the Mexica had a new ruler, a shrewd and determined man named Itzcoatl, or Obsidian Serpent. He was guided by one of the most influential figures in Mesoamerican history, his chief advisor, a shadowy and brilliant man named Tlacaelel. When Maxtla of Azcapotzalco demanded their complete submission, the Mexica court was thrown into a panic. Many nobles argued for appeasement, terrified of provoking the full might of the Tepanec Empire. But Tlacaelel argued passionately for war. He convinced Itzcoatl that this was their one and only chance to seize their own destiny, that a life of servitude was no longer an option. It was a terrifying gamble, a declaration of war against a superpower that had dominated the valley for generations. Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel knew they could not win this war alone. They needed allies. Their most important potential partner was a man with a deep and personal hatred for the Tepanecs, Nezahualcoyotl, the fasting coyote. He was the brilliant and cultured prince of the city of Texcoco. On the eastern shore of the lake, years earlier, the Tepanecs had conquered his city and murdered his father, forcing Nezahualcoyotl to flee into exile, where he had been living as a fugitive, composing poetry and plotting his revenge. When the Mexica sent word that they were rising up, Nezahualcoyotl eagerly joined their cause. To this alliance, they added the much smaller city of Tlacopan, a dissident Tepanec town that was happy to turn on its oppressive capital, and so it was born. A military coalition of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. This was the Triple Alliance. The Tepanec War was swift and decisive. In 1428, the Allied armies besieged the capital of Azcapotzalco. The Mexica, who for decades had entered the city as humble tribute payers, now swarmed its causeways as vengeful conquerors. They smashed the Tepanec armies, captured the tyrant Maxtla, and tore his city apart, symbolically cutting open his heart on the ruins of his own kingdom. The once despised upstarts from the swamp had overthrown the most powerful empire in the land. In the aftermath of their stunning victory, the three cities formalized their partnership. The Triple Alliance would now rule the valley and beyond. They agreed to go to war together and to divide the spoils of all future conquests. It was not quite an alliance of equals. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco were the senior partners, each receiving 2/5 of all tribute, while Tlacopan, the junior member, would receive the final fifth. With this political and military foundation in place, Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel then made a move of audacious genius. To secure the Mexica's place as the leaders of this new order, they decided to rewrite history itself. Tlacaelel ordered that all the ancient historical books of their people, the painted codices that told the story of their humble origins and their long years of servitude, be gathered up and burned. He argued that these old stories were full of lies and were unfit for the new chosen people of the sun. It was the ultimate act of deleting your old, embarrassing posts. Tlacaelel and the court scribes then created a new official history, one in which the Mexica were not poor, wandering Chichimecs, but the divinely ordained heirs to the Toltec legacy, and their tribal war god, Huitzilopochtli, was elevated to the status of the supreme deity of the cosmos. Their long migration was no longer a flight of refugees, but a divinely guided quest. Their founding of Tenochtitlan was not a desperate act of survival, but the fulfillment of a cosmic prophecy. This new history was now the only one that could be taught. With a new past and a powerful new alliance, the Mexica were ready to build their future. The unstoppable force that history would call the Aztec Empire had been forged in the fires of rebellion. With the Tepanec Empire crushed and the Triple Alliance in command of the Valley of Mexico, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan were no longer just survivors. They were masters. A steady stream of tribute, food, raw materials, luxury goods, and human captives began to flow from conquered towns and cities into their island capital. With this newfound wealth and an almost limitless supply of labor, they began a project of urban transformation that would, over the next century, turn their once humble island of mud and reeds into one of the most magnificent and populous cities on Earth. A visitor approaching Tenochtitlan in the year 1500 would have been awestruck before they even set foot in the city. It appeared as a shimmering mirage in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a man-made mountain range of white-plastered pyramids and palaces rising directly from the water. 3 massive, stone-paved causeways, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, connected the city to the shores of the lake, marching for miles in impossibly straight lines. These causeways were punctuated by removable wooden bridges, which could be pulled up in times of war, turning the entire city into an impregnable fortress. Alongside them ran great aqueducts, marvels of engineering that brought fresh, clean drinking water from the springs on the mainland into the heart of the city. But the true genius of the Mexica was how they solved the problem of living on a swamp. They perfected a system of agriculture that was so productive it allowed them to feed a population of over 200,000 people, a city larger than any in Europe at the time. They built chinampas, the so-called floating gardens. These were not truly floating, but were man-made islands, rectangular plots of intensely fertile land created by fencing off a section of the shallow lakebed and piling it high with rich mud and decaying vegetation. They planted willow trees along the edges, whose dense roots anchored these new lands firmly to the lake bottom. The Mexica essentially invented the ultimate form of organic, locally sourced urban farming, centuries before it became trendy. Their entire city was a giant farm-to-table restaurant. A dense network of canals separated these chinampas, serving as the city's streets. Instead of carts, canoes glided silently through the city, carrying produce, building materials, and people from place to place. At the absolute center of this watery metropolis was the spiritual and political heart of the empire, the sacred precinct. It was a vast walled square, a city within a city, dominated by the terrifying splendor of its great pyramid, the Templo Mayor. This was not a single pyramid, but a massive platform crowned with two twin temples at its summit. One temple, painted a stark, bloody red, was dedicated to the Mexica's patron, the war god Huitzilopochtli. The other, painted in brilliant blues and white, was dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and fertility. This duality was the central statement of the Aztec state. Its power came from a combination of military might and agricultural abundance, from the tribute gained through war and the sustenance granted by the gods. The steps of these temples, as we shall see, were perpetually stained with the evidence of their gratitude. Surrounding the Templo Mayor were dozens of other temples, priests' quarters, and sacred monuments, including a round temple dedicated to the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, and, most chillingly, a massive tzompantli, a towering rack displaying thousands of the skulls of sacrificial victims, a grim and public accounting of the state's piety. If the sacred precinct was the city's soul, its commercial heart was the great market in the neighboring sister city of Tlatelolco. The Spanish conquistadors, who later saw it, were stunned into silence, comparing it to the grandest markets of Rome and Constantinople. Every day, tens of thousands of people gathered there to buy, sell, and trade the riches of the empire. The market at Tlatelolco was the Amazon.com of its day, but with more haggling and a much better food court. You could find anything: gleaming gold and silver jewelry from the Mixtec lands, brilliant green quetzal feathers from the cloud forests of the Maya frontier, jade, jaguar pelts, cacao, and tobacco. There were stalls for every kind of food, from dogs and turkeys to lake algae, which was made into a kind of cheese. There were merchants selling obsidian blades, pottery, fine textiles, and enslaved people. The market was so vast and well organized that judges patrolled its corridors, ready to haul any cheater or thief off to an immediate trial. Tenochtitlan, at its zenith, was a city of stunning contrasts. It was a place of incredible order and engineering, yet it was built on a foundation of constant, brutal warfare. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, with the Emperor's Palace containing magnificent botanical gardens and aviaries filled with thousands of exotic birds. Yet, just a short walk away, stood the horror of the Skull Rack. It was a city that was at once a bustling, pragmatic commercial hub and a fanatically devout ceremonial center. To understand this paradox, to understand why the most beautiful flowers in the emperor's garden were nourished by the blood spilled on the Templo Mayor, one must understand the Mexica's vision of the cosmos, a universe balanced on the razor's edge of destruction. To understand the paradox of Tenochtitlan, a city of both exquisite beauty and unspeakable bloodshed, we must look past the stone and canals and into the minds of the Mexica. We must explore their vision of the cosmos, a universe that was profoundly beautiful, terrifyingly fragile, and balanced on the razor's edge of imminent destruction. Their worldview was fundamentally shaped by a deep and abiding sense of cosmic insecurity. They were not living in the first glorious dawn of creation. They were living in its fifth and final act. According to their sacred histories, the universe had already been created and destroyed 4 times. Each of these eras, or suns, had ended in a cataclysm that wiped out the world and the form of humanity that inhabited it. The first sun, the jaguar sun, was devoured by monsters. The second sun, the wind sun, was obliterated by hurricanes. The third sun, the rain sun, was consumed by a rain of fire. The fourth sun, the water sun, was drowned in a great flood. The Aztec worldview was, at its core, pessimistic. They lived in the fifth installment of a divine franchise, where the first 4 chapters all had very unhappy endings. You can understand why they were a little anxious about how this last one would turn out. The creation of their current era, the fifth sun, was born from an act of divine sacrifice. The legend tells that after the destruction of the fourth sun, the gods gathered in the darkness at the ancient ruined city of Teotihuacan. To rekindle the light, one of them had to make the ultimate sacrifice, to leap into a great ceremonial fire and be consumed, to be reborn as a new sun. 2 gods volunteered, the arrogant, wealthy Teotihuacan and the humble, sickly Nanahuatzin. 4 times Teotihuacan approached the terrifying blaze, and 4 times his courage failed him. It was the humble Nanahuatzin who, without hesitation, cast himself into the flames. He emerged in the east as the brilliant, powerful sun. Shamed by this display of courage, Teotihuacan finally threw himself into the weakening embers and emerged as the far less brilliant moon. But a terrible problem remained. The new sun hung motionless in the sky. It refused to begin its journey. It was weak and demanded nourishment before it would move. And so, in a final, primordial act of creation, the other gods agreed to sacrifice themselves. One by one, they offered their hearts and their sacred blood to the new sun. Fed by this divine energy, the fifth sun finally began to move, starting its daily journey across the sky. And the present era of the world was born. This myth was the single most important story in the Mexica world. It established a sacred and unbreakable precedent. The universe is set in motion and sustained by sacrifice. The gods had given their own lives to create the world. Humanity, as the beneficiaries of this divine act, had a solemn and inescapable debt to repay. This duty was constant and urgent. The Mexica believed that their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, in his guise as the sun, was engaged in a constant daily battle. Every evening, he would sink into the underworld and fight a desperate war against the forces of darkness. His sister, the moon, and his 400 brothers, the stars. To have the strength to defeat them and rise again victorious each morning. He needed to be fed. The food he craved was the most potent and sacred substance in the universe, Chalchihuatl, or precious water, human blood. The heart, as the seat of life and energy, was the ultimate offering. Therefore, human sacrifice was not an act of wanton cruelty. It was, in their worldview, the single most important human responsibility. It was a cosmic necessity, a desperate and ongoing effort to keep the sun alive, to keep the crops growing, to keep the forces of chaos at bay, and to prevent the violent end of their world. Every captive warrior who was led up the steep steps of the Templo Maya was seen as a messenger to the gods, a participant in the reenactment of the original divine sacrifice. And the wars the Aztecs fought were not just for territory and tribute. They were the primary means of obtaining these sacred offerings. During times of peace, this need was met through a chillingly pragmatic institution known as the Xochiaoyotl, or Flower War. These were prearranged, ritualized battles fought between the Triple Alliance and their perpetually unconquered enemies, like the neighboring city-state of Tlaxcala. The Flower Wars were a rather grim solution to a supply chain problem. When you need a constant stream of high-quality offerings for the gods, you can't always wait for a real war to break out, so you schedule one. The objective of these limited engagements was not to conquer land, but specifically to capture enemy warriors alive, to be brought back to Tenochtitlan for later sacrifice. And so the cycle continued. War provided the tribute that fed the people, and the captives that fed the gods. This religious ideology was the engine that drove the Aztec Empire, a self-reinforcing loop of conquest and sacrifice that was, from their perspective, the only thing holding back the final, terrifying darkness. The ideological engine of sun worship and sacrifice, combined with the political engine of the Triple Alliance, drove the Mexica on a century of nearly uninterrupted conquest. By the dawn of the 16th century, their empire, the Aztec Empire, was the largest and most powerful state Mesoamerica had ever seen. Its domain stretched from the arid deserts of the north to the humid jungles of the Maya frontier, from the coast of the Gulf of Mexico to the shores of the Pacific. It was a mosaic of hundreds of conquered city-states and diverse ethnic groups, all bound together by the terrifying power of the Mexican armies and the relentless demands of the imperial tribute system. And in the year 1502, one man inherited the immense task of ruling this vast and volatile world. His name was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, or Moctezuma the Younger, the man history would remember as the last great emperor of the Aztecs. He was not a simple despot. Moctezuma had been trained as a high priest before becoming emperor, and he was a devout, scholarly, and deeply serious man, obsessed with ritual, protocol, and the signs of the divine. He was also a proven military commander who led successful campaigns to expand the empire, and a stern political reformer who centralized power in his own hands, transforming the emperorship from a position of first among equals to that of a semi-divine, absolute monarch. He ruled from a palace of unimaginable splendor in the heart of Tenochtitlan, a sprawling complex of such scale and luxury that the Spaniards who later saw it would stammer in their attempts to describe it. The empire he controlled was, at its core, a machine for extracting wealth. It was like a massive subscription box service, But instead of artisanal coffee, conquered provinces had to deliver thousands of warrior costumes and tons of corn, and the penalty for a late shipment was significantly more severe than a bad review. Twice a year, imperial tax collectors would visit the nearly 400 tributary towns and consult their painted codices to ensure that the proper amount of tribute was paid. It was a staggering river of goods that flowed into Tenochtitlan: maize, beans, cotton cloth, jade, turquoise, gold dust, and exotic animal skins. Long-distance merchants, known as the Pochteta, managed the trade of luxury goods from the farthest reaches of the land, and also served as the emperor's eyes and ears, a network of spies reporting on the affairs of provinces both conquered and coveted. In his palace, Moctezuma was surrounded by a level of luxury and formality that bordered on the divine. Thousands of servants attended to his every need. He ate from a feast of hundreds of dishes served on fine Cholula pottery, drank chocolate frothed and served in cups of pure gold, and was said to never wear the same set of fine cotton clothes more than once. The etiquette of his court was suffocatingly rigid. Nobles had to enter his presence barefoot and were forbidden from looking him directly in the eye or turning their backs upon him. The level of formality was intense. It makes modern corporate meetings seem like a casual beachfront barbecue. His palace complex included not just audience chambers and living quarters, but also vast botanical gardens and a magnificent zoo and aviary, filled with every species of animal and bird from across his empire. Cages of roaring jaguars, pens of coiled serpents, and enclosures filled with thousands of brilliantly colored birds, a living collection that symbolized his absolute dominion over the known world. Yet for all this power, all this wealth, and all this control, the historical accounts claim that in the final years of his reign, Moctezuma was a man haunted by a profound sense of dread. A series of strange and terrifying events, a succession of dark omens, seemed to signal that the end of the fifth sun was near. Whether these omens actually occurred or were simply stories told in hindsight to make sense of the catastrophe to come is a question historians still ponder. But the legends are powerful. A tongue of fire, like a flaming ear of corn, was seen in the night sky. The great temple of Huitzilopochtli spontaneously burst into flames. A bolt of lightning struck another temple without a sound of thunder. The waters of the lake were said to have boiled and surged, flooding a portion of the city. A weeping woman was heard in the streets at night, crying out for her lost children. The most terrifying omens were the last two. Fishermen captured a strange, ash-colored bird with a mirror polished into the crown of its head. When it was brought to Moctezuma, he looked into the mirror and saw not his own reflection, but a vision of a vast army of strange, warring men. And in the streets, monstrous, two-headed people would sometimes appear, only to vanish without a trace the moment they were brought before the emperor. For Moctezuma, a man steeped in a religion of cyclical destruction, these signs were not random occurrences. They were messages from the gods, and they seemed to align with a chillingly specific prophecy. The ancient priest-king of the Toltecs, Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, had vanished into the east centuries before, vowing to one day return. The year of his prophesied return was Tse-Acatl. One reed, by a staggering coincidence of history, the year 1519 in the Christian calendar was in the Aztec calendar, the year one reed. And so the most powerful man in the Americas, the master of a continent, sat in his magnificent palace, surrounded by his treasures, and fearfully stared east, out across the waters of the great sea, waiting for a god to return. In his palace in Tenochtitlan, the Emperor Moctezuma, master of the known world, stared at the reports from his spies and felt a profound religious dread. The year was Teotihuacan, one reed, and from the east, exactly as the prophecy had foretold, the strangers had come. The reports from the Gulf Coast were baffling, describing things that had no place in the Mexica universe. There were floating mountains, moving on the water, men with skin as pale as limestone, with hair on their faces like the corn silk, who carried sticks that could create thunder and lightning. They rode upon giant, hornless deer that were fearsome and fast, and they were accompanied by large, aggressive dogs that dripped saliva from their open mouths. For Moctezuma, the devout priest, this could only mean one thing: the returning god, Quetzalcoatl, or at least his emissaries, had arrived to reclaim his throne. The leader of these strange men was Hernan Cortés, and he was no god. He was a minor Spanish nobleman, a man of immense ambition, intelligence, and utter ruthlessness, who had mortgaged everything he owned to launch this expedition. In fact, he was a mutineer. The governor of Cuba, fearing Cortés's ambition, had rescinded his permission for the voyage, but Cortés launched his fleet anyway. In a flagrant act of defiance, he basically started the most important expedition in Spanish history by stealing the ships and ignoring his boss's direct orders. It was the ultimate example of it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, especially when permission was definitely going to be no. His force was incredibly small for the task of confronting an empire. Just over 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a few small cannons. By any rational measure, his mission was suicidal. Moctezuma's initial reaction was a mixture of sacred terror and diplomatic caution. He sent high-ranking ambassadors to the Spanish camp, bearing with them gifts of staggering wealth. These were not random treasures. They were the sacred regalia of the gods, including the feathered headdress and turquoise mask of Quetzalcoatl himself. They also brought two massive discs, one of solid gold and the other of silver, as large as cartwheels, representing the sun and the moon. Moctezuma's plan to send the strangers these incredibly valuable golden gifts to make them go away was, in retrospect, a terrible strategy. It was like trying to get rid of a burglar by showing them you're safe. The sight of so much gold only inflamed the Spaniards' greed and hardened Cortés's resolve to march to the capital and seize the source of this wealth for himself. Cortés had a secret weapon, one far more valuable than any cannon. Among a group of enslaved women given to the Spanish was a young noblewoman named Malintzin, later baptized as Marina, whom we know as La Malinche. As a child, she had been sold from a Nahua-speaking homeland into slavery among the Maya of the Gulf Coast. She was therefore fluent in both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and the Mayan dialect spoken by a shipwrecked Spaniard in Cortés's party. This created a translation chain that unlocked the empire for Cortés. But Malinche was more than a mere interpreter. She was a brilliant political and cultural advisor. She explained to Cortés the fractured reality of the Aztec Empire, the resentment of the conquered peoples, the hatred for the Mexica, and the existence of independent kingdoms who were the Aztecs' mortal enemies. She taught him how to navigate the complex political landscape, who to flatter and who to fight. With this knowledge, Cortés made his audacious gamble. After establishing a base on the coast, he ordered his men to scuttle their own ships, deliberately sinking them. There would be no retreat. They would either conquer this new land or they would die here. Then he began his march inland, heading directly for the territory of the one people who had never been conquered by the Aztecs, the fierce warrior confederacy of Tlaxcala. At first, the Tlaxcalans met the Spanish with ferocious resistance, their massed armies nearly overwhelming the small European force in a series of brutal battles. But the Spaniards' steel armor, crossbows, and disciplined tactics, combined with the terror inspired by the horses, allowed them to survive. The Tlaxcalan leaders, seeing the newcomers' military prowess, made a calculated decision. They saw in Cortés not a conqueror, but the perfect instrument for their revenge against their hated enemies in Tenochtitlan. They forged an alliance. Suddenly, Cortés's tiny band of adventurers was transformed into the command corps of a massive indigenous army. Thousands of elite Tlaxcalan warriors eager to settle a century of grievances. To prove his loyalty to his new allies and to send a message of terror across the land, Cortés marched on the great city of Cholula, a major religious center and a tributary ally of the Aztecs. Luring the Cholulan nobility and warriors into one of the city's main courtyards under the pretense of a peaceful meeting, Cortés sprung a trap. The Spanish and Tlaxcalans fell upon the unarmed Cholulans, massacring thousands in a calculated act of state terror that was broadcast across the empire. The message was clear. The newcomers were as ruthless as the Mexica, and any who stood in their way would be annihilated. And so the strange army, a small corps of bearded men in steel armor, surrounded by a vast host of indigenous warriors, marched out of the smoking city of Cholula. They climbed the high, cold pass between the two snow-capped volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and looked down for the first time upon the heart of their enemy, the Valley of Mexico, with the great city of Tenochtitlan gleaming like a white and golden jewel in the center of the vast blue lake. The Spanish and their vast army of Tlaxcalan allies descended from the high mountain pass, and the jewel of the valley, Tenochtitlan, grew larger and more incredible with every step. As they reached the great Iztapalapa causeway, a delegation of Mexican nobles came out to greet them. And finally, carried on a magnificent litter adorned with gold and brilliant quetzal feathers, came the emperor himself, Moctezuma II. The two leaders, Hernán Cortés and Moctezuma, met for the first time on that causeway, two worlds colliding in the persons of these two men. In a gesture that would seal his doom, Moctezuma, still believing the newcomers might be divine emissaries, welcomed them into his city, housing them in the lavish palace of his own father. For a week, the Spaniards lived as honored guests, wandering the city in a state of wonder, dazzled by its markets, its temples, and its incredible order. But Cortés knew his position was impossibly precarious. He and his few hundred men were on an island, surrounded by tens of thousands of Mexica warriors who could crush them at any moment. He made a decision of almost unimaginable audacity. He and a few dozen of his captains marched to Moctezuma's palace, and through a combination of threats and persuasion, they took the emperor hostage. Taking a divine ruler captive in the heart of his own capital is one of the boldest or craziest moves in military history. It's the geopolitical equivalent of walking into a lion's den and trying to put a leash on the lion. For months, an uneasy peace held. Cortes ruled the empire through his puppet emperor, sending out parties to explore for gold and trying to consolidate his strange and fragile authority. The situation exploded into violence when Cortes was forced to leave the city to confront a rival Spanish force that had landed on the coast. He left his hot-tempered lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in command. During a major religious festival, Alvarado, either out of greed or a paranoid fear of an uprising, made a fatal error. He ordered his soldiers to block the exits to the sacred precinct and slaughter the thousands of unarmed Mexican nobles and priests who were engaged in a sacred dance. The massacre was a tipping point. The city, which had tolerated the stranger's presence, erupted in a unified, incandescent rage. When Cortes returned, he found Tenochtitlan in a state of total war. The Mexica furiously assaulted the palace where the Spanish were barricaded. Moctezuma was brought out onto a rooftop to try and calm his people, but he was met with a shower of stones and arrows. He died shortly after, though historians still debate whether he was killed by the stones of his own people or secretly murdered by the Spanish. With their emperor dead and the city baying for their blood, the Spanish position was hopeless. On a dark and rainy night in June of 1520, they attempted a desperate escape. It became known as La Noche Triste, the sad night. Weighed down by stolen gold, the Spanish and their allies were swarmed on the causeways. The Mexica attacked from all sides, from canoes on the lake and on foot from the rooftops. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies were killed, drowned, or captured for later sacrifice. It was a crushing defeat. A battered and broken remnant of the army finally limped back to the safety of Tlaxcala. It seemed the Aztec Empire had saved itself. But as the Spanish recovered, an invisible and far more terrible conqueror was making its way through the city. An enslaved African with the Spanish fleet had been carrying smallpox, a disease utterly unknown in the Americas. With no natural immunity, the Mesoamerican peoples were defenseless. The disease swept through Tenochtitlan like a fire, killing with horrifying speed. It wiped out nearly half the population in a matter of months. One of its victims was the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, the hero who had driven the Spanish out. The plague shattered the Mexica leadership, decimated their armies, and created a crisis of faith. How could their gods allow such a pestilence to destroy them while their enemies remained untouched? Cortes, meanwhile, was preparing his revenge. He rallied his Tlaxcalan allies and spent months building a weapon that would doom the island city. He ordered the construction of 13 small warships called brigantines, which could be fitted with cannons. In an incredible logistical feat, these ships were built in Tlaxcala, then disassembled and carried in pieces by thousands of porters over the mountains, to be reassembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. In the spring of 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. The Spanish ships gave Cortes control of the lake, allowing him to defeat the Mexica war canoes and blockade the causeways, cutting off all food and fresh water. The final battle was a slow, brutal, house-by-house agony that lasted for nearly 3 months. Led by their final heroic emperor, the young Cuauhtemoc, the starving and disease-racked Mexica fought with a desperation born of despair, defending every street, every canal, every rooftop. The Spanish and their allies were forced to systematically demolish the beautiful city as they advanced, tearing down the palaces and temples to fill in the canals. The final battle for Tenochtitlan was a tragic, brutal affair. The Mexica were fighting for their world, while the Spanish and their allies were literally dismantling one of its greatest wonders to conquer it. It was a victory, but one achieved by destroying the very prize they sought. On August 13th, 1521, the last pocket of resistance was crushed, and Cuauhtemoc was captured. The beautiful city was a smoking, rubble-strewn ruin. The Aztec Empire was no more. The silence that fell over the ruins of Tenochtitlan on that August day in 1521 was the silence of a world ending. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtemoc, was a captive. The great temples were shattered and smoking, and the survivors of the siege stumbled through the wreckage of their beautiful city, dazed by hunger, disease, and a grief so profound it had no name. The fifth sun, the era of the Mexica, had not been ended by a rain of fire or a great flood, but by men with steel swords, invisible diseases, and a host of vengeful allies. This was not just the fall of a city, but the collapse of a cosmic order. In the immediate aftermath, Hernán Cortés made a decision of immense symbolic power. He would not abandon the ruined capital. He ordered that the rubble of the Aztec pyramids be cleared, and that a new city, the capital of the new Spanish colony, be built directly on top of the old foundations. The Templo Mayor was raised, and its stones were used to build the foundations of a great Christian cathedral. The palace of Moctezuma was torn down to make way for the palace of the new Spanish viceroy. Mexico City would rise, quite literally, from the ashes of Tenochtitlan, a European city built upon the bones of an American one, a statement of permanent conquest and superimposition. The military conquest was followed by a spiritual one. Franciscan and Dominican friars arrived, filled with a fervent desire to save the souls of the indigenous peoples by eradicating their old beliefs. They saw the native gods as demons and the sacred rituals as devil worship. In great public ceremonies, they burned hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the precious painted books, the codices that held the histories, the genealogies, and the religious knowledge of the Mesoamerican world. It was a cultural catastrophe, an irreplaceable library of human knowledge turned to ash. The old religions were outlawed, the old temples were forbidden, and the people were brought into the fold of the Catholic Church. But a worldview that has been nurtured for 3,000 years does not simply vanish. It goes underground. It adapts. What emerged in the centuries that followed was not a purely Spanish culture, but a profound and complex fusion, a process of syncretism that defines Mexico to this day. The old gods put on new masks. The hill that had once held a shrine to the Aztec mother goddess, Tonantzin, became the site where the dark-skinned Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico, was said to have appeared. the modern day of the dead celebrations, with their candy skulls and their offerings of food and marigolds for the deceased, blend the Catholic traditions of All Saints' Day with the far more ancient and vibrant traditions of Mesoamerican ancestor veneration. The old world did not die. It learned a new language, and its echoes are all around us, in things we see and taste and say every single day. The languages of the Mexica, the Maya, and their neighbors live on, not only in the millions of indigenous people who still speak them, but in the words that have seeped into our own global vocabulary. Every time we speak of chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote, or chili, we are speaking a few words of Nahuatl. Perhaps the most successful conquest was the one Mesoamerican food waged on the rest of the world. The sacred trinity of maize, beans, and squash, along with their companions, revolutionized the diet of the entire planet. It's a quiet victory, one in every kitchen that uses a chili pepper, or every person that enjoys a piece of vanilla. A delicious and living reminder of the world we've been exploring. The greatest legacy, of course, is the people themselves. They endured the trauma of conquest, the ravages of disease, and the oppression of the colonial system. The descendants of the ancient pyramid builders, the artists, the astronomers, and the farmers are still here. Their resilience is the final, unbroken thread that connects the distant past to the vibrant present. And so, our long story comes to its close. A journey that began with the first footsteps across a frozen continent and ends among the echoes of fallen empires. We have walked with the mammoth hunters in a world of ice and stood in the humid swamps as the first Olmec heads were carved. We have seen the jungle pyramids of the pre-classic Maya giants at El Mirador, and we have felt the tension in the courts of the twin serpent kingdoms, Tikal and Calakmul. We have descended into the tomb of the great King Pakal at Palenque, and we have stood in awe before the silent, orderly avenues of Teotihuacan. We have followed the warrior priests of the Toltecs and witnessed the feathered serpent reborn at Chichen Itza. And finally, we have seen the improbable rise and the tragic fiery fall of the Mexica and their magnificent island capital, Tenochtitlan. These were not myths or legends, but real worlds filled with real people whose lives were as complex and meaningful as our own. Their story is a reminder that civilizations are fragile, that worlds can and do end, but that the human spirit, the languages we speak, the food we eat, and the stories we tell have a remarkable power to endure. The echoes of these ancient worlds are not just in the ruins. They are in the quiet rustle of a cornfield, in the flavor of chocolate, and in the faces of the people who walk this ancient land today, carrying the memory of the sun, blood, and sacrifice in the long and patient dream of their history. Now, let the voices of the kings and priests fall silent. Let the smoke from the temples drift away into the quiet of the night. The story is over, and the time has come to rest, to let these images of stone and jungle and jade fade into the soft landscape of your own peaceful slumber.